Yo my sleepy homies, what's popping? Today was pretty slow for me, so let's wrap it up with something wonderful here tonight, because we're travelling back to a time when the night sky was an open book written in stars, and sleeping outdoors wasn't a camping adventure but simply Tuesday evening. This is the story of how the Celtic people, those remarkable inhabitants of ancient Europe, managed to sleep soundly beneath the open heavens without turning into historical popsicles. If you're new here, as always, joining the community is super cool and easy. Just tap subscribe and like the video and let me know where in the world you're watching from and what time it is for you. Now, find your sweet spot for sleeping and let's begin. Imagine yourself standing on a hillside somewhere in what we now call Ireland, Scotland, Wales or Brittany, around 500 BCE. The landscape before you looks like someone took every romantic painting of the British countryside you've ever seen and dialed up the wildness by several notches. Rolling hills stretch toward horizons that seem impossibly distant, covered in grasses that shift from emerald to jade depending on how the wind touches them. The forests here aren't the tidy managed woodlands you might encounter on a modern nature trail. These are deep, ancient groves where oak trees have been growing since before your great-great-great-grandparents' great-great-great-grandparents were born. The canopy overhead creates a living cathedral, filtering sunlight into green-gold beams that make you feel like you've stepped into a place where the ordinary rules of the world don't quite apply. The Celtic peoples, and yes, we pronounce it Celtic when talking about these historical folks, not the basketball team pronunciation, occupied a vast swathe of Europe stretching from modern-day Turkey to the Atlantic Ocean. They weren't a single unified nation like we think of countries today, but rather a collection of tribes who shared similar languages, artistic styles, and ways of understanding the world. Think of them less like a political entity, and more like a cultural family with lots of interesting cousins who didn't always get along at reunions. These people lived in a world where the boundary between the practical and the spiritual was about as distinct as morning mist. To them, everything had presence and meaning. Rivers weren't just water flowing downhill, but living entities with personalities. Trees weren't merely plants, but beings worthy of respect and sometimes consultation. The land itself breathed with them, and they arranged their lives according to its rhythms rather than trying to impose their will upon it. The climate in Celtic territories varied considerably depending on location, but much of it shared certain characteristics that would become important for our story about sleeping outdoors. The British Isles and northern France experienced what meteorologists politely call maritime temperate conditions, which is a fancy way of saying it was often cool, frequently damp, and occasionally downright inhospitable. Summers could be pleasant, with long twilights that stretched almost to midnight, but winters brought short days, long nights, and the kind of cold that settles into your bones like an unwelcome houseguest who won't take the hint to leave. Yet within this challenging environment, the Celtic people thrived. They raised cattle and sheep, grew crops, crafted objects of stunning beauty, and developed a sophisticated understanding of their world that allowed them to live comfortably in conditions that would send most modern people running for the nearest thermostat. Their relationship with sleep, night, and the outdoors reflected this deep connection to their environment. The Celtic year revolved around seasonal festivals that marked important transitions. Samhain in late October heralded the beginning of winter and the dark half of the year, when nights grew long and the veil between worlds grew thin. Imbolc in early February celebrated the first stirrings of spring and the lengthening of days. Beltane in May welcomed summer's arrival with bonfires and celebrations of fertility and growth. Lughnasadh in August marked the beginning of harvest season. These weren't just parties or religious observances, they were practical acknowledgements of the changing relationship between people and their environment. Each season brought different challenges and opportunities for sleeping arrangements, different considerations for staying warm and dry, and different relationships with the night sky and the darkness that fell like a heavy cloak across the land. The Celtic cosmos was structured differently from how we typically think of the universe today. There wasn't a clear separation between earth and sky, day and night, waking and sleeping, or living and dead. Everything existed on a continuum, with permeable boundaries that could be crossed under the right circumstances. Night wasn't simply the absence of day, but a different state of being, when different rules applied and different possibilities emerged. This worldview shaped everything about how Celtic people approached the act of sleeping, especially when sleeping outdoors. They didn't see nighttime exposure to the elements as something to be merely endured or as a sign of poverty or hardship. Instead, sleeping beneath the stars could be a choice, a practice, or even a sacred act that connected them more deeply to the rhythms of the natural world and the movements of the cosmos above. As you settle deeper into your modern bed with its memory foam and climate control, consider how different your relationship with sleep might be if you understood night not as an interruption of productive daylight hours, but as its own valuable realm, with its own gifts to offer those brave or skilled enough to embrace it fully. Before we can understand how Celtic people slept outdoors without freezing, we need to appreciate the warm, secure bases they created for themselves when sleeping indoors. The Celtic roundhouse wasn't just a dwelling, it was a masterpiece of practical engineering disguised as a simple structure. Picture a building shaped like a large basket turned upside down, with walls made of wattle and daub, essentially woven branches covered with a mixture of mud, clay, straw, and sometimes animal dung. Before you wrinkle your nose at that last ingredient, understand that it was an excellent binding agent and when dried didn't smell like you might imagine. The walls rose to about the height of a modern single-storey house, then curved inward to meet a peaked roof thatched with reeds, heather, or straw. The most distinctive feature of these homes was their circular shape, which wasn't merely an aesthetic choice but a brilliant practical decision. A round structure has no corners where cold air can pool and no walls that bear more wind stress than others. The design distributed weight and wind resistance evenly, making these homes remarkably sturdy against the storms that regularly swept across the landscape. At the centre of each roundhouse burned the heart of Celtic home life, the hearth fire. This wasn't a decorative fireplace like you might have in a modern living room, but a working fire that provided heat, light and cooking capability, and served as the social and spiritual centre of domestic life. The fire burned continuously, tended throughout the day and banked carefully at night to preserve coals for easy rekindling in the morning. The smoke from this central fire rose upward through the thatched roof, which acted as a natural filtering system. The thatch would absorb some of the smoke while allowing the rest to escape gradually, creating a natural ventilation system that kept the interior from becoming unbearably smoky while still retaining warmth. The smoke also had the beneficial side effect of helping to preserve meat hung in the rafters and deterring insects that might otherwise infest the thatch. Around the perimeter of the roundhouse, raised platforms or simple wooden frames covered with animal skins and furs created sleeping areas. These weren't beds in the modern sense, but rather designated zones where people would pile furs, woolen blankets, and their own cloaks to create nests of warmth. Families often slept together, with children nestled between parents and grandparents, using shared body heat as another layer of insulation against the night's cold. The flooring varied by region and status, but often consisted of packed earth, sometimes covered with rushes or straw that could be swept out and replaced when it became too soiled. Wealthier households might have wooden flooring, which provided better insulation from the cold ground below. The earth floor itself provided some thermal mass. It would absorb heat from the fire during the day and release it slowly throughout the night, creating a more stable interior temperature than you might expect. Celtic homes were typically arranged in small clusters or villages, positioned to take advantage of natural features that provided protection from weather and enemies. A settlement might nestle into the lee side of a hill to shelter from prevailing winds or occupy a defensible position near water sources. The homes faced various directions, but often the entrance was positioned to avoid the worst of winter storms, while allowing the morning sun to provide natural warmth and light. The size of a roundhouse varied depending on the wealth and status of its inhabitants, ranging from modest single-family dwellings about 20 feet in diameter to large communal structures that could accommodate extended families, or serve as meeting halls. A typical family home might be 30 feet across, providing ample space for living, sleeping, cooking, and storing essential supplies. Inside these homes, the temperature could remain surprisingly comfortable even in winter. The combination of the central fire, good insulation from thick walls and thatch, the heat-retaining properties of the earth floor, and the shared warmth of multiple bodies created an environment that was certainly cooler than modern heated homes, but far warmer than the outdoor conditions. On a winter night when temperatures outside might drop to freezing or below, the interior of a well-maintained roundhouse could stay in the range that we'd consider comfortably cool, perhaps the temperature of a modern room in autumn before you've quite convinced yourself to turn on the heating. But here's what's important for our story about sleeping outdoors. The comfort of these homes wasn't taken for granted. Celtic people understood viscerally what it meant to be cold, wet, and exposed to the elements because they experienced these conditions regularly. When they chose to sleep outdoors, whether by necessity during travels or warfare or by choice during seasonal activities or spiritual practices, they brought with them knowledge gained from their relationship with both comfort and discomfort, warmth and cold. The roundhouse represented more than physical shelter. It embodied the Celtic understanding that survival in their environment required working with natural materials and natural principles, rather than trying to dominate or completely separate themselves from the world outside their walls. This philosophy would prove essential when circumstances required them to sleep beneath the stars without the protection of those sturdy walls and that warming central fire. Now we arrive at the practical heart of our story. How did the Celtic people actually prepare for nights spent outdoors without succumbing to hypothermia or simply being too miserable to function the next day? The answer involves a combination of materials, techniques, and knowledge that would impress modern survival experts. First, let's talk about clothing, because the Celtic wardrobe was essentially their portable shelter system. The foundation of their outdoor survival strategy started with wool, that miracle fibre that keeps you warm even when wet, which was a rather important feature in the damp Celtic climate. Sheep had been domesticated in Europe for thousands of years by the Celtic period, and these people had become masters at processing wool into various forms of protection against the elements. Celtic people wore multiple layers of woolen clothing. Against the skin, a wool or linen tunic provided the base layer. Over this, another longer tunic or woolen dress, then potentially a heavy woolen cloak that could serve multiple purposes. This cloak, called a brat in the Irish Celtic language, was the Swiss Army knife of Celtic outdoor equipment. It could be worn as a garment, wrapped as a blanket, used as a ground sheet, or even rigged as a simple tent shelter with some cordage and stakes. The weaving of these woolen textiles was remarkably sophisticated. Celtic weavers created fabrics with different weights and textures for different purposes. Some wool was woven loosely to trap more air for better insulation, while other cloth was woven tightly to resist water and wind. The natural lanolin in wool provided some water resistance, and wealthier individuals might have cloaks that were partially waterproof through treatment with additional fats or oils. Colour played a role too, though perhaps not the way you might expect. While we often imagine ancient people wearing drab browns and greys, Celtic peoples actually produced vibrant dyed fabrics using plants, lichens and minerals. However, for outdoor survival, darker colours had practical advantages. They absorbed more heat from whatever sunlight was available, and they showed less dirt and wear during extended periods without washing. Footwear deserves special mention because anyone who's tried sleeping with cold feet knows that temperature extremes in your extremities can make restful sleep nearly impossible. Celtic shoes range from simple leather moccasins to more elaborate boots that wrapped around the foot and lower leg. The leather was often lined with fur or stuffed with dried grass for insulation. Some people wore multiple pairs of socks made from wool or wrapped their feet in woolen cloth before putting on their shoes. When preparing for a night outdoors, a Celtic person's checklist would have included items that modern campers would recognise alongside some that might seem unusual. A leather bag or woven basket would carry supplies, dried meat or cheese, perhaps some oatcakes or other portable food. A fire-starting kit which might include iron and flint for striking sparks, char cloth for catching those sparks, and dry tinder carefully preserved in a waterproof container made from animal bladder or tightly woven fabric coated with beeswax. Water presented interesting challenges. Leather bottles or ceramic vessels could carry water, but they added weight and could freeze in winter. Experienced travellers knew the landscape well enough to plan routes that passed near springs, streams, or other water sources. They understood which water was safe to drink directly and which needed boiling, a sophisticated knowledge of hydrology gained through generations of careful observation. For sleeping itself, Celtic people employed several strategies depending on circumstances and available resources. The simplest method involved finding natural shelter, an overhanging rock formation, a hollow in a hillside, the lee side of a large boulder, anything that would break the wind and potentially provide some protection from rain. These natural features were well known and remembered, becoming part of the mental map that every traveller carried. Once a sleeping spot was chosen, preparation began with addressing the ground itself. Sleeping directly on bare earth, especially cold or damp ground, is an excellent way to lose body heat through conduction. The solution was simple but effective. Create insulation between your body and the earth. Dried bracken ferns, gathered and piled thick, made an excellent insulating layer. Heather, dead leaves, dried grass, pine needles, any dry plant material could serve this purpose, creating a buffer that trapped air and prevented the ground from sucking warmth directly from your body. On top of this insulating layer, you'd spread your cloak or an animal hide if you had one. Then you'd essentially burrito yourself in your remaining woolen garments and any additional cloaks or blankets you'd carried. The key was creating dead airspace around your body, layers that trapped your own body heat rather than allowing it to radiate away into the night. Fire, when possible, transformed an outdoor sleeping arrangement from merely survivable to actually comfortable. But Celtic people understood fire in ways that went beyond simply piling wood together and striking a light. They knew how to build long-lasting fires that would burn steadily through the night with minimal attention, using large logs laid parallel or rocks heated in the flames, then positioned around the sleeping area to radiate warmth for hours after the fire died down. One particularly clever technique involved heating stones in the fire, then carefully wrapping them in leather or thick cloth, and placing them at the feet or core of the body, ancient hot water bottles that could keep you warm for several hours. The trick was getting the temperature right. Too hot and you'd burn yourself or scorch your wrappings. Too cool and they'd lose heat too quickly to be useful. But not every night allowed for fire. Rain could make it impossible, or circumstances might require avoiding the attention that flame and smoke would attract. For these situations, Celtic people relied on their layering systems and their understanding of how bodies lose heat. They knew to cover their heads. You can lose significant body heat through your skull. They knew to keep moving if they started to feel too cold, to generate warmth through activity before settling down to sleep. They understood that sleeping in groups, sharing warmth, could mean the difference between dangerous cold and tolerable discomfort. There's something almost humorous about imagining a group of Celtic warriors or travellers essentially cuddling together for warmth, like a litter of puppies. But survival often requires setting aside concepts of personal space. In their worldview, there was no shame in doing what was necessary to live through the night and wake ready for the next day's challenges. With all this preparation in mind, let's explore the actual experience of sleeping outdoors in the Celtic world. What it felt like, what it meant, and why people might choose this experience even when they had the option of a warm roundhouse. First, understand that sleeping outdoors wasn't always a matter of hardship or necessity. While travellers, traders, warriors, and shepherds certainly spent nights under the stars because their work demanded it, there were also cultural and spiritual reasons why someone might deliberately choose to sleep outside even when a comfortable indoor option was available. The Celtic relationship with the night sky was fundamentally different from ours. Without electric lights, the darkness after sunset was profound in a way that most modern people never experience. When the sun set on a clear night away from hearth fires, the darkness wasn't just an absence of light, but an almost tangible presence. Your eyes would adjust gradually, and what first appeared as absolute blackness would reveal itself as a canvas painted in countless shades of shadow. Then, after this adjustment, the stars would emerge with a brilliance that modern light pollution has stolen from most of us. On a clear night, away from settlements, the Milky Way would stretch across the sky like a river of light, so bright and detailed that you could almost believe you might fall upward into its depths if you stared too long. The ancient Celtic peoples saw not just points of light, but also stories, patterns, guides for navigation, and indicators of seasonal change. Imagine settling into your prepared sleeping spot on such a night. The ground beneath you, cushioned by your carefully gathered bracken and ferns, provides more support than modern people might expect. Not soft like a mattress, but firm and surprisingly comfortable once you find the right position and your body adapts to the surface. Your woolen layers envelop you like a cocoon, the fabric still holding some warmth from your body heat during the day's activities. The sounds of the night surround you, quite different from indoor sleeping, where thick walls muffle external noise. There's the whisper of wind through grass, or the more substantial rustle of wind through tree branches if you're camped near a forest. The occasional crack of a twig as some nocturnal animal goes about its business, which might make your heart rate increase momentarily until you identify it as a deer or rabbit, rather than something more threatening. If you're near water, perhaps the gentle murmur of a stream or the intermittent croaking of frogs. The scents, too, differ entirely from indoor sleeping. Instead of smoke-tinged interior air, you breathe the fresh, complex smell of the outdoors. Earth, grass, the faintly spicy scent of crushed bracken, the mineral smell of nearby rocks, perhaps the sweet decay of autumn leaves if the season is right. In spring, the night air might carry the perfume of blooming flowers. In summer, the rich green smell of growing things. In autumn, the sharp, clean scent of approaching cold. Temperature management during the night required constant minor adjustments. As the night deepened and temperatures dropped, you might pull your cloak tighter around yourself or curl into a more compact position to minimize heat loss. If you were sleeping near a fire, you might wake periodically to add more fuel or adjust your position relative to the warmth. This wasn't the deep, uninterrupted sleep that modern people often expect, but rather a more rhythmic pattern of sleeping and partial waking that actually corresponded better to natural human sleep cycles than our modern 8-hour blocks. The Celtic people recognized different qualities of sleep and different kinds of rest. They understood that the sleep you got outdoors, though perhaps lighter and more interrupted than indoor sleep, had its own value. There was rest that came from deep unconsciousness, but there was also rest that came from quiet awareness of your surroundings, from feeling the earth beneath you and the sky above you, and from knowing yourself to be part of the larger patterns of the natural world rather than separated from them by walls and roofs. Weather, of course, could transform outdoor sleeping from peaceful to challenging rather quickly. The approach of rain on the wind would wake an experienced outdoor sleeper, sending them scrambling to adjust their shelter or move to better protection before the deluge arrived. Heavy rain could make sleeping outdoors genuinely difficult, though not impossible with proper preparation. The sound of rain on leaves or grass creates a particular kind of white noise that can actually deepen sleep, and if you're adequately protected from the water itself, rainfall can make for a surprisingly restful night. Snow presented different challenges and opportunities. A fresh snowfall actually provided excellent insulation, and experienced Celtic people knew that a snow-covered shelter could be warmer than one exposed to wind. The technique of letting snow accumulate over your sleeping spot, essentially creating a primitive snow cave, was understood and used when conditions permitted. The danger, of course, was getting wet during the snowfall or before settling in for the night, as wet clothing in cold conditions was genuinely life-threatening. Wind was perhaps the most difficult weather condition for outdoor sleeping, because it stripped away your carefully created layers of warm air no matter how well you'd prepared. A strong wind could make even a mild temperature feel bitterly cold, and the constant buffeting made restful sleep nearly impossible. This is why finding windbreaks, natural formations, or even self-constructed barriers of branches and packed earth was such an important part of site selection. For those who spent multiple nights consecutively outdoors, shepherds following their flocks to seasonal grazing areas, for instance, the experience took on a different quality. The first night might feel challenging and uncomfortable, your body and mind still attuned to indoor comfort. By the third or fourth night, though, something shifted. Your body adapted to the rhythms, your senses grew keener, and your ability to read weather signs and adjust accordingly became more intuitive. You became, temporarily, a creature that belonged to the outdoor world rather than a human visitor camping in it. This state of adaptation was valued in Celtic culture, seen as a way of maintaining connection to the fundamental nature of existence that could be forgotten in the relative comfort and isolation of permanent dwellings. The person who could sleep soundly beneath the stars, wake refreshed, and function effectively the next day demonstrated a kind of competence that commanded respect. The spiritual dimension of Celtic nighttime practices adds another layer to understanding how and why these people slept outdoors. The Druids, the learned class that served as priests, judges, teachers, and advisors in Celtic society, had particular relationships with night, darkness, and the practices surrounding sleep that elevated outdoor sleeping beyond mere practical necessity. Druids underwent years of training that included memorizing vast amounts of traditional knowledge, poetry, lore, and spiritual teachings. Part of this training involved developing intimate familiarity with the natural world through direct experience, which necessarily included spending extensive time outdoors at all hours and in all seasons. A druid who couldn't comfortably sleep beneath the stars and who didn't understand the patterns of nocturnal animals and night-blooming plants would be considered incompletely trained. The Celtic spiritual worldview held that darkness and night weren't simply the absence of light and day, but rather their own positive states with distinct qualities and possibilities. Night was when the boundary between the ordinary world and the other world grew thinner, when communication with spirits and deities became easier, when dreams and visions carried prophetic weight, and when certain kinds of knowledge became accessible that remained hidden during daylight hours. For Druids and those pursuing spiritual development, sleeping outdoors could be a deliberate practice rather than a necessity imposed by travel or work, spending the night at a sacred site, a special grove, a spring believed to have healing properties, or a hilltop with particular spiritual significance, allowed for dreams and experiences that would be impossible in the ordinary domestic environment. These weren't casual overnight camping trips, but serious spiritual undertakings that required preparation both physical and mental. A person seeking a prophetic dream or divine guidance might spend days in preparation, fasting or eating only certain foods, performing ritual purifications and memorizing appropriate prayers or invocations. Then they would journey to the sacred site and sleep there, open to whatever the night might bring. The dreams that came during these sacred outdoor sleeps were considered qualitatively different from ordinary dreams. They were messages from the gods, communications from ancestors, glimpses of possible futures, or teachings about the fundamental nature of reality. Upon waking, the dreamer would carefully remember and interpret these experiences, often with the guidance of experienced druids who understood the language of sacred dreams. Stars held particular significance in this spiritual framework. The Celtic peoples recognized constellations and tracked the movements of celestial bodies with sophisticated precision. They understood the relationship between stellar positions and seasonal changes, using the night sky as a calendar and clock more reliable than any human-made timekeeping device. To sleep beneath the stars was to place yourself directly under this celestial calendar, to align yourself with cosmic rhythms that governed everything from planting schedules to spiritual practices. The moon, of course, commanded special attention. Its phases marked the passage of time and influenced decisions about when to plant, when to harvest, when to perform certain rituals, when to go to war, and when to make peace. Sleeping outdoors meant having direct, unfiltered exposure to moonlight, which was believed to carry its own form of power that could affect dreams, health, and spiritual state. There were specific nights considered particularly auspicious or powerful for outdoor sleeping. The night of the full moon in certain months, the longest night of the year at the winter solstice, the equinoxes when day and night achieved perfect balance, and the quarter days between solstices and equinoxes that marked major seasonal festivals. On these nights, druids and spiritually inclined individuals might deliberately sleep outdoors to maximise their exposure to the special energies and possibilities these times offered. Interestingly, the Celtic concept of day actually began at sunset rather than sunrise. A new day started when darkness fell, which meant that the first activity of any new day was sleeping. This reversed our modern understanding, where sleep concludes one day and waking begins another. In the Celtic framework, sleep was the foundation of the day, the opening act rather than the closing one, which elevated its importance and imbued it with significance we rarely attribute to sleep today. This spiritual dimension didn't make outdoor sleeping any physically warmer or more comfortable, but it provided a framework of meaning that could transform discomfort from something to be merely endured into something to be valued as part of a larger purpose. The cold, the hard ground, the vulnerability of sleeping exposed to the elements, these became not hardships, but essential elements of the experience, tests and teachers that shaped both body and spirit. The Druids understood something that modern sleep science is only recently confirming, that our sleeping environment profoundly affects not just whether we sleep, but the quality and nature of that sleep, including our dreams and the psychological processing that occurs during rest. By deliberately choosing to sleep in sacred outdoor locations, they were essentially creating specific conditions for specific kinds of consciousness to emerge. Winter in the Celtic territories could be genuinely dangerous, transforming the landscape from a challenging but manageable environment into something that could kill the unprepared with cheerful efficiency. Understanding how the Celtic people slept outdoors during winter months represents the pinnacle of their cold weather survival knowledge. First, it's important to note that truly voluntarily sleeping outdoors in the depths of winter, when temperatures plunged and storms raged, was rare even in Celtic culture. These people weren't foolish, and they understood the difference between manageable challenge and unnecessary risk. Most winter nights were spent in the warmth and security of roundhouses, clustered with family around the central hearth, while storms battered the stout walls and wind howled through the thatch. But circumstances didn't always offer choices. Warriors on campaign, messengers carrying urgent communications, herders whose animals had strayed, hunters caught far from home by an unexpected storm, travellers who miscalculated distance or weather. All these people might find themselves facing a winter night outdoors without adequate shelter. The key to surviving such situations was a combination of knowledge, preparation, and above all avoiding panic. Panic wastes energy, clouds judgment, and leads to poor decisions that compound rather than solve problems. Celtic people trained their children from young ages to stay calm in dangerous situations, to think clearly about available options, and to remember and apply traditional survival knowledge even when frightened or uncomfortable. Winter survival began with understanding that you were fighting a battle against multiple enemies simultaneously: cold, wind, wet, and exhaustion. Each of these could kill you independently, but they often worked together, with wet clothes making you colder, cold making you exhausted, and exhaustion making you make poor decisions about staying dry and warm. Success required addressing all these threats systematically. The first priority was always finding or creating shelter from wind. Wind chill could make a tolerable temperature lethal, stripping away your body's heat faster than you could generate it. Natural windbreaks, dense groves of evergreen trees, rock formations and hillsides provided the foundation for winter sleeping spots. If nature hadn't provided adequate wind protection, you created it, using whatever materials were available to construct barriers between yourself and the moving air. Snow, counterintuitively, became an ally if you understood how to work with it. Fresh snow is mostly trapped air, making it an excellent insulator. The technique of building snow shelters, ranging from simple snow walls to more elaborate snow caves, was well understood. A properly constructed snow shelter could maintain an interior temperature significantly warmer than outside, even without a fire, simply because the snow blocked wind and the small enclosed space trapped body heat. The construction process itself generated warmth through physical activity. though you had to be careful not to work so hard that you sweated excessively, as wet clothing in winter conditions was extremely dangerous. Experienced Celtic people knew to work steadily but not frantically, removing layers of clothing if necessary to avoid overheating, then adding them back once the shelter was complete and physical activity decreased. Fire became even more critical in winter, but also more challenging to achieve. Wood might be wet from snow or rain, making it difficult to ignite. The solution was careful fire management, carrying dry tinder in waterproof containers, knowing where to find dry wood even in wet conditions, the underside of fallen logs and the dead lower branches of evergreen trees that remained protected from precipitation by the living canopy above, and understanding how to create platforms that lifted your fire above wet ground. A winter fire wasn't just for warmth but for drying. Wet clothing, wet footwear and wet gloves. These were deadly in cold conditions, and a fire allowed you to carefully dry essential items without scorching them. The process required patience and attention, rotating items near the heat, and monitoring constantly to prevent damage while ensuring thorough drying. Body position during winter sleeping mattered more than in milder seasons. You needed to minimize exposed surface area while maintaining enough comfort to actually rest. The fetal position, curled tightly with knees drawn up, head tucked down, and arms wrapped around your core, was the standard winter sleeping posture because it presented the minimum surface area to the cold while protecting your vital organs and warming your extremities with your own breath. Breathing technique played an unexpected role in winter survival. Breathing through your nose rather than your mouth warmed and humidified incoming air before it reached your lungs, making it easier for your body to maintain core temperature. Drawing your cloak or blanket over your face created a small breathing pocket, where your exhaled air would warm incoming breath, though you had to be careful not to create so much humidity that the fabric became damp with frozen condensation. The placement of insulating materials beneath and around your body became even more critical in winter. Direct contact with frozen ground could pull heat from your body with frightening speed. Multiple layers of insulation, thick piles of any available plant material, multiple animal skins if you had them, even layers of clothing you weren't wearing, created barriers between your body and the heat-stealing earth. Groups had distinct advantages in winter survival. Multiple people could pool resources, share body heat, take turns maintaining fires, and provide psychological support that countered the despair that cold and exhaustion could produce. There's archaeological and textual evidence suggesting that Celtic warriors and travellers in winter often moved in groups partly for this survival benefit, knowing that collective warmth and shared labour increased everyone's chances of surviving difficult nights. The morning after a harsh winter night outdoors presented its own challenges. Your body would be stiff and cold, your muscles reluctant to move, and your joints protesting any activity. But movement was essential to restore circulation, to generate warmth, and to assess your condition and that of your companions if you had any. The Celtic practice was to rise before full dawn if possible, moving carefully at first but with increasing vigour, ideally toward a destination where proper warmth, dry clothing, and hot food could be found. Remarkably, we have evidence that Celtic people not only survived these harsh conditions but often thrived afterward. There's a particular kind of satisfaction that comes from successfully navigating difficult circumstances, from pitting your knowledge and will against nature's challenges and emerging victorious. Those who had weathered hard winter nights outdoors and lived to tell the tale gained status and confidence that carried into other aspects of their lives. As you nestle deeper into your modern bed, perhaps now feeling especially grateful for your central heating and insulated walls, let's explore how the Celtic understanding of sleeping in harmony with nature has influenced our world, and what wisdom we might still extract from their practices. The Celtic approach to outdoor sleeping wasn't primitive ignorance making the best of bad situations. It was sophisticated knowledge accumulated over generations and refined through careful observation and experience. Modern survival training still teaches many of the same principles that Celtic people understood instinctively. The importance of insulation from the ground, the value of layering, the critical need for staying dry, and the life-saving potential of windbreaks and simple shelters. When modern outdoor educators talk about leaving no trace, packing out what you pack in, and minimising your impact on natural spaces, they're articulating an ethic that the Celtic people lived as a matter of course. Their approach to outdoor sleeping was inherently sustainable. They used natural materials that returned harmlessly to the environment. They didn't require manufacturing or transportation chains, and they worked within nature's limits rather than trying to overcome them through technology. The Celtic understanding that humans are part of nature rather than separate from it, that we can adapt to outdoor sleeping rather than requiring completely artificial environments, challenges our modern assumption that comfort requires isolation from the natural world. Contemporary research into sleep health is actually rediscovering many principles that Celtic people knew through lived experience. For instance, modern sleep scientists have found that sleeping in completely dark environments, with temperatures cooler than most people keep their homes, often produces deeper and more restorative sleep than sleeping in warm, artificially lit rooms. The Celtic experience of sleeping outdoors, where darkness was absolute and temperatures naturally cool, aligned more closely with these optimal conditions than many modern sleeping arrangements. The Celtic practice of breaking sleep into multiple cycles rather than expecting one uninterrupted block also aligns with recent research into human sleep patterns. Before artificial lighting, many cultures practiced what historians call first sleep and second sleep, a period of rest, then waking for an hour or two of quiet activity, then returning to sleep until dawn. This pattern, which Celtic people would have followed naturally when sleeping outdoors and tending fires, may actually be more natural to human biology than our modern 8-hour block. The materials Celtic people used for warmth and comfort, wool, animal hides, and plant fibres, have properties that modern synthetic materials still struggle to match. Wool's ability to insulate when wet, its natural temperature regulation, and its breathability. These features made it ideal for outdoor sleeping in unpredictable weather. The resurgence of interest in natural fibres for outdoor gear and bedding suggests that we're recognising the wisdom embedded in these traditional materials. Their roundhouse design principles have influenced sustainable architecture movements. The circular structure, the use of local materials, the passive solar heating and natural ventilation, and the integration with rather than domination of the surrounding landscape. All these concepts appear in modern eco-friendly building design. Architects looking for alternatives to energy-intensive conventional construction often find inspiration in structures that people like the Celtic peoples perfected thousands of years ago. The Celtic spiritual understanding of sleep as a valuable state of consciousness, rather than merely a biological necessity, offers wisdom that our productivity-obsessed culture needs. We tend to view sleep as dead time, unconsciousness to be minimized so we can maximize waking activities. The Celtic view that sleep was the foundation of the day, and that dreams and night consciousness had their own value, suggests a healthier relationship with this essential human need. Modern forest bathing practices, wilderness therapy, and outdoor recreation movements are essentially rediscovering what Celtic people knew, that spending time in natural settings, including sleeping outdoors, has profound benefits for physical and mental health. The reduction in stress hormones, the improved immune function, and the psychological restoration that comes from disconnecting from artificial environments and reconnecting with natural ones. These aren't New Age inventions, but rather ancient wisdom being validated by contemporary research. The Celtic approach to preparation and planning for outdoor sleeping provides a model for thinking about resilience and adaptation more broadly. They didn't try to make the outdoors identical to their indoor environment, or to completely eliminate discomfort and risk. Instead, they developed knowledge and skills that allowed them to thrive across a wide range of conditions, adapting their practices to circumstances rather than requiring circumstances to adapt to them. This adaptive flexibility has relevance far beyond sleeping arrangements. In our current era of climate change and environmental uncertainty, the Celtic model of working with natural systems rather than trying to dominate them offers valuable guidance. Their success came not from conquering nature, but from understanding it so deeply that they could align their practices with its patterns. The community aspects of Celtic life, including their approach to outdoor sleeping, remind us that humans are fundamentally social creatures who benefit from cooperation and shared knowledge. The way they taught outdoor survival skills to younger generations, the way they travelled and camped in groups for mutual support, and the way they shared stories and techniques. These practices built social bonds while transmitting practical knowledge. In our individualistic modern culture, where we often approach challenges alone and measure success by personal achievement, the Celtic emphasis on community resilience offers an alternative model. Their understanding that group survival often depends on ensuring no one freezes, goes hungry, or faces dangers alone suggests an ethic of mutual care that's worth recovering. The linguistic legacy of the Celtic peoples, the languages that evolved into modern Irish, Scottish Gaelic, Welsh and Breton, carries embedded within it concepts and distinctions that reflect their relationship with night, sleep and the natural world. These languages have specific words for states of consciousness, types of darkness, and qualities of rest that don't translate neatly into English, preserving perspectives on sleep and night that might otherwise be lost. Place names throughout the former Celtic territories often reference sleeping places, camping spots, or locations associated with rest and shelter, evidence that the knowledge of where one could safely sleep outdoors was important enough to be encoded in the landscape itself. These names still guide hikers and travellers today, though often without their knowing the ancient survival wisdom embedded in the geography. The storytelling traditions that emerge from Celtic culture, including the vast body of myths, legends and folk tales that were passed down orally for generations, often featured nighttime settings, dreams, and the wisdom that came from sleeping in sacred places. These stories weren't just entertainment, but ways of transmitting cultural values and practical knowledge, teaching listeners about the relationship between humans and the natural world. Modern festivals and celebrations that descend from ancient Celtic traditions, including various Halloween customs that trace back to Samhain, maintain echoes of the Celtic understanding that darkness and night have their own power and significance. Though commercialised and transformed, these celebrations preserve something of the ancient acknowledgement that night is not merely the absence of day, but its own meaningful reality. The archaeological evidence left by Celtic peoples, their hill forts, their sacred sites, their settlements positioned with careful attention to natural features, demonstrates a sophisticated understanding of landscape and environment that supported their ability to live successfully in challenging conditions. Modern archaeologists studying these sites are continually impressed by the knowledge of geography, weather patterns, water sources, and ecological relationships that the placement of Celtic structures reveals. Perhaps most importantly, the Celtic legacy reminds us that human beings are remarkably adaptable creatures, capable of thriving in a wide range of conditions when we develop appropriate knowledge and skills. We've become so dependent on climate control, artificial lighting, and technological comfort that we sometimes forget our species successfully inhabited diverse environments for thousands of years before these conveniences existed. This doesn't mean we should abandon modern comforts or pretend that sleeping outdoors in winter is superior to sleeping in a heated home. But remembering that our ancestors could and did sleep soundly beneath the stars without freezing expands our sense of human possibility. It suggests that we're more resilient, more capable, and more connected to the natural world than our current lifestyle might lead us to believe. The Celtic peoples aren't a remote, primitive culture whose practices are merely historical curiosities. They're our ancestors, literally for those with European heritage, and culturally for all of us who are part of the human family that has always had to negotiate the challenge of sleeping comfortably and safely in a world that doesn't automatically cater to our needs. They are solutions to the problem of sleeping outdoors without freezing, understanding materials and their properties, reading weather and landscape, preparing carefully, adapting flexibly, maintaining knowledge across generations, and supporting each other through difficult conditions. These are human solutions to human problems, as relevant in principle today as they were 2,000 years ago. As our journey through Celtic sleeping practices draws to a close, let's return to where we began. That warm round house with its central hearth, its curving walls, and its thatched roof filtering smoke into the night sky. Because understanding how Celtic people could sleep outdoors without freezing requires understanding that they always had this warm base to return to, this foundation of comfort and security that made temporary discomfort manageable. Imagine a Celtic person returning home after several nights spent outdoors. Perhaps a shepherd who'd been with the flocks in high pastures, or a warrior returning from a campaign, or a trader who'd carried goods to a distant settlement. The sight of home would have carried emotional weight we can scarcely imagine in our world of constant indoor climate control. As they approached their settlement, they would see the smoke from hearth fires rising into the evening sky, smudging the sunset with grey wisps that signalled warmth, food, safety, and rest. The dogs of the village would announce their arrival with barking, and children might run out to greet them, full of questions about where they'd been and what they'd seen. Entering the roundhouse after time spent outdoors would be like entering another world. The temperature difference would hit immediately. The wave of warm air carrying the scent of the fire, cooking food, and the distinctive smell of home. Eyes would need to adjust from the bright outdoors to the dimmer interior, where firelight danced across walls and faces, creating a cave-like atmosphere that felt protective and nurturing. The returning traveller would shed their outdoor gear layer by layer, appreciating each piece that had kept them alive and comfortable during their journey. The heavy wool cloak, perhaps damp from rain or stiff with frost, would be spread near the fire to dry. Muddy shoes would be removed and set aside for cleaning. Additional layers would come off until they wore only light indoor clothing, feeling their body relax as the need for constant thermal regulation decreased. Family members would press food and drink into their hands, warm broth, fresh bread, perhaps mead or ale. The simple act of eating hot food after days of cold rations would be intensely pleasurable, the warmth spreading through their body from the inside. Conversation would flow as they shared stories of their journey, describing the places they'd slept, the weather they'd encountered, the food, and the people they'd met. Later, when it was time for sleep, they would make their way to their sleeping spot along the roundhouse wall, settling into furs and blankets that felt impossibly soft and warm after nights of sleeping on bracken and cold ground. The sounds of family sleeping nearby, the crackle of the banked fire, the knowledge of solid walls and a good roof between them and the elements. All of this would create a sense of security and comfort that made falling into deep sleep easy and natural. This contrast between outdoor sleeping and indoor comfort was essential to the Celtic experience of both. They didn't take indoor warmth for granted precisely because they knew what it was to sleep cold. They didn't ignore the value of wild places precisely because they knew the security of home. Each experience gave meaning and context to the other. The skills and knowledge required for outdoor sleeping weren't separate from domestic life but integrated into it. Children learned about insulating materials by helping gather bracken for bedding, by watching their parents bank the fire for the night, and by listening to stories of journeys and adventures. The same wool that made their indoor blankets made their outdoor cloaks. The same understanding of fire that kept the hearth burning kept travellers warm on cold nights away from home. The Celtic calendar of festivals, with its acknowledgement of seasonal changes and the passage from light to dark and back again, reflected this integration of outdoor and indoor, wild and domestic, challenging and comfortable. The festivals themselves often involved both aspects, feasting and warmth indoors alternating with outdoor rituals and ceremonies that reconnected people to the land and sky. As the winter solstice approached and nights grew longest, the hearth became the centre of the life, and outdoor sleeping became something to be avoided except when absolutely necessary. But as the wheel of the year turned and spring arrived, the balance shifted. Longer days and warmer nights made outdoor sleeping pleasant again, and people would naturally spend more time in wild places, reconnecting with aspects of the world that winter's harshness had temporarily made less accessible. This cyclical understanding that there are times for indoor comfort and times for outdoor challenge, that both have their place and their value, reflects a wisdom about human life that goes beyond sleeping arrangements. We need both security and adventure, both routine and novelty, both the warmth of the hearth and the call of wild places beneath open stars. The Celtic peoples lived this balance instinctively, moving between domestic space and wild space with a fluidity that our more rigidly structured modern lives often lack. They didn't see these as opposing states, civilization versus wilderness, comfort versus hardship, but as complementary aspects of a full human life. Their round houses, positioned thoughtfully within the landscape rather than dominating it, symbolize this relationship. The homes provided shelter and comfort, but remained connected to the environment through their materials, their design, and their orientation to seasonal changes. You were never so far from nature that you forgot its power, but you had enough protection that you could rest, raise children, and build a life that extended beyond mere survival. This integrated approach allowed them to develop the sophisticated knowledge of outdoor sleeping that we've been exploring. Because they maintained regular contact with wild places, because sleeping outdoors was a normal part of life rather than an exotic adventure, they accumulated practical wisdom that was tested and refined across countless generations. As you settle into your final comfortable position for the night, wrapped in your modern blankets in your climate-controlled room, take a moment to look beyond your immediate surroundings and imagine the vast span of human experience that your simple act of going to sleep connects you to. Thousands of years ago, your distant ancestors, whether literally your genetic forebears or the broader human family to which we all belong, faced the same basic need that you're addressing now, the need for rest and restoration that sleep provides. But they faced it without the technological cushion that we take for granted, without central heating or electric lights or insulated buildings. The Celtic peoples we've been exploring tonight managed this challenge with grace, skill, and a depth of knowledge about materials, weather, landscape, and human physiology that allowed them not just to survive, but to thrive. They slept beneath the stars without freezing because they understood wool and wind, fire and shelter, and preparation and adaptation. But beyond the practical details, the layers of clothing, the insulating bracken, the careful selection of sleeping spots, they brought something else to the challenge of sleeping outdoors, a worldview that saw themselves as part of nature rather than separate from it, that valued night as much as day, and that understood rest as a sacred act rather than merely a biological necessity. This worldview allowed them to find meaning and even beauty in experiences that we might view as purely hardship. The night sky they slept beneath wasn't just a cold void to be endured, but a display of celestial wonder to be appreciated. The ground they slept on wasn't merely hard and uncomfortable, but the living earth that sustained them. The darkness they rested in wasn't something to be banished with artificial light, but a different state of being with its own gifts and possibilities. We've lost some of this wisdom in our journey toward technological comfort. We've gained climate control and soft mattresses and electric lights that push back the darkness, but we've also lost the intimate knowledge of how to be comfortable in the natural world, how to read weather and landscape, and how to find rest in conditions that would now send most of us fleeing for the nearest hotel. Yet this knowledge isn't completely lost. It lives on in the genetic memory of our adaptable human bodies, in the archaeological and linguistic traces left by Celtic culture, in the practical survival skills that outdoor educators teach, and in the spiritual practices that still recognize night and darkness as valuable, rather than merely frightening. More importantly, the fundamental truth that the Celtic peoples embodied remains valid. Human beings are remarkably capable of adaptation and resilience when we develop appropriate knowledge and maintain it across generations. We can sleep soundly beneath the stars without freezing. We can find rest in wild places. We can align ourselves with natural rhythms rather than fighting against them. This doesn't mean we should abandon our modern comforts or pretend that sleeping on the ground is superior to sleeping in a proper bed. Comfort is not a sin, and there's no virtue in unnecessary hardship. But remembering that we possess this capability, that our species developed these skills, and that they remain latent within us expands our sense of what's possible. It reminds us that we're not as fragile or as dependent on technology as we sometimes feel. It suggests that when circumstances require it, whether camping trips for fun or serious emergencies that force us outdoors, we can draw on reserves of knowledge and capability that we didn't know we possessed. The Celtic peoples have been gone for centuries. Their language evolved into new forms, their territories transformed by subsequent waves of history, and their specific practices adapted and changed beyond recognition. But the fundamental relationship they maintained with the natural world, their understanding of how to sleep comfortably in challenging conditions, their integration of practical skill with spiritual meaning, these gifts remain available to us if we choose to reclaim them. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable modern bed, you're connected to an unbroken chain of human sleepers stretching back through the Celtic peoples to the very origins of our species. Every single one of your ancestors, going back tens of thousands of years, successfully navigated the challenge of sleeping safely and restfully enough that they survived to reproduce and eventually create you. This chain of successful sleepers, this heritage of rest and resilience is yours to claim. The wool that kept Celtic travellers warm still keeps us warm. The stars they navigated by still wheel overhead. The human need for rest that they honoured we still feel. The basic relationship between our bodies and the natural world hasn't fundamentally changed, even if our immediate circumstances have. So as sleep takes you, perhaps your dreams will carry you back to that ancient landscape, to green hills and deep forests, to round houses with glowing hearths and star-filled skies above. Perhaps you'll walk for a moment in the experience of people who knew how to be truly at home in the world, who could find rest anywhere from the softest furs to the hardest ground, and who understood that sleeping beneath the stars without freezing wasn't a feat of endurance, but simply a skill to be learned and a gift to be appreciated. And when you wake tomorrow in your comfortable modern world, you'll carry with you the knowledge that somewhere in your human heritage lies the capability to rest peacefully beneath the open sky, wrapped in wool and wisdom, connected to the earth and stars, safe and warm despite the cold, sleeping soundly in the embrace of the natural world. Sweet dreams, and may the stars watch over you as they watched over countless generations before us. Imagine New England in late February 1717, back when Boston was still a collection of wooden buildings huddled around a harbour, and the entire population of Massachusetts numbered fewer people than a modern suburban shopping mall on a Saturday afternoon. You're living in a world lit by candles and warmed by fireplaces, where your entertainment options consist of reading the same books you've read 20 times, doing needlework until your fingers cramp, or staring out the window and wondering if spring will ever arrive. Colonial New Englanders had a complicated relationship with winter. On one hand, they'd chosen to live in a place where winter lasted roughly from October to May, so clearly they weren't entirely opposed to cold weather. On the other hand, their diaries and letters from this period read like extended complaints to a landlord who refuses to fix the heating. Winter was something you endured, prepared for obsessively, and then complained about with the satisfaction of someone who's earned the right to grumble. By late February 1717, most New Englanders thought they'd already survived the worst of winter. February in colonial times was what we'd call late winter. The snow was old and crusty, the firewood pile was getting concerningly low, and everyone was starting to think longingly about mud season, which tells you something about how tired they were of snow. Children had already had months of what passed for snow days, though in their case it meant more chores rather than sleeping in and hot chocolate. The typical colonial household in 1717 was preparing for early spring with the optimism of people who really should have known better. You'd be checking your seed stores, planning your garden, and perhaps doing some early maple sugaring if the weather cooperated. Your house, and let's be honest about colonial architecture, was essentially a wooden box with a fireplace, some small windows that let in drafts more effectively than light, and enough gaps in the walls that you could almost see your breath indoors on particularly cold mornings. Daily life revolved around staying warm and fed, which took approximately all your waking hours. Your morning began before dawn, when someone had to revive the banked fire from the night before, a process that involved poking at barely glowing coals and praying they'd cooperate. Water had to be fetched from the well, assuming it wasn't frozen solid. Breakfast needed cooking, animals needed tending, and all of this happened in the dark because the sun had the courtesy to arrive fashionably late in winter. Women spent their days in an endless cycle of cooking, spinning, weaving, sewing, and trying to keep children from either burning themselves on the fireplace or dying of boredom. Men worked outside when weather permitted, doing repairs, chopping wood, and checking on livestock that had the good sense to look miserable about the whole situation. Everyone, regardless of age or gender, spent a significant portion of their day simply trying to stay warm enough to function. The landscape itself in late February was what we might charitably call tired. Snow that had fallen in December was now grey and crusty, pockmarked with soot from chimneys and various other evidence of human habitation that we won't detail before bedtime. The forests were skeletal black lines against grey skies, and the ocean was a cold, dark presence that occasionally reminded everyone of its existence by freezing at the edges. But there was a rhythm to this life that modern people might find almost appealing in its simplicity. You knew what needed doing because it was the same thing that needed doing yesterday and would need doing tomorrow. Your neighbours were facing identical challenges, which created a sense of community born from shared suffering. When the sun set, which happened depressingly early, you gathered around the fire with your family and whoever else was staying the night, and you made the best of it. Late February weather in New England has always been unpredictable, a meteorological coin flip between maybe spring is coming and, surprise, here's more winter. Colonists watched the sky with the intensity of people whose lives depended on weather prediction, which they did. A storm could mean being trapped indoors for days, unable to work, unable to travel, and possibly running dangerously low on supplies. The barns and outbuildings were stocked with hay for the animals, though by late February those supplies were running low, and the hay that remained was probably not the highest quality. Cows, horses, oxen, pigs and chickens all depended on human care to survive the winter, and all complained about their circumstances in their own ways. The chickens probably had the most to complain about, actually, since they'd stopped laying eggs weeks ago and were just eating resources while providing nothing but the occasional egg that felt like winning the lottery. Your root cellar would be carefully organised with the remaining stores of preserved food, apples getting softer by the day, root vegetables beginning to sprout, barrels of salted meat, crocks of butter preserved under salt, and whatever else you'd managed to preserve from last year's harvest. Every meal required a calculation. Is this worth using now, or should we save it for later? How much later? What if spring doesn't come for another 6 weeks? The social fabric of colonial New England was tight-knit by necessity. Your nearest neighbour might be a quarter-mile away, but you knew their business almost as well as your own because survival often depended on cooperation. If someone's barn caught fire, everyone came to help. If a family ran short of food, neighbours shared what they could. If someone got sick or injured, the community rallied around them because there was no other option. Religious life provided structure and community in ways that modern people might find either comforting or suffocating, depending on their perspective. Sunday meeting at the church was mandatory, both legally and socially. You sat in an unheated building for hours listening to sermons that were theologically complex and often focused on sin and redemption, with an intensity that made Game of Thrones seem light-hearted. But church was also where you saw everyone, heard news from other towns, and felt part of something larger than your individual struggle to stay alive through winter. Children in 1717 had childhoods that would seem impossibly harsh by modern standards. They worked from the time they could walk, learned to read using the Bible and whatever few books the family owned, and had responsibilities that included genuinely dangerous tasks like managing fires and handling large animals. But they were still children. They played when they could, created games from nothing, and found joy in simple pleasures like a successful sled ride or the discovery of icicles in interesting shapes. The elderly held a respected position in colonial society, partly because surviving to old age was an achievement in itself. If you made it to 60 or 70, you'd survive diseases, accidents, harsh weather, and periodic conflicts with indigenous peoples or other colonial powers. Your experience and knowledge were valuable resources, and you were often consulted on everything from weather prediction to medical treatment, whether or not you actually knew what you were talking about. As February 1717 progressed toward its end, New Englanders had no idea they were standing at the edge of one of the most remarkable weather events in American history. They went about their routines, complained about the cold with the dedication of people who took complaining seriously, and looked forward to March with the hope that it might bring slightly less terrible weather. The sky that late February showed no particular warning signs that we know of. Colonial weather prediction was based on folklore, careful observation of animal behaviour, and a general sense of what the sky looked like before trouble arrived. If your bones ached more than usual, rain or snow was probably coming. If the chickens acted strange, though defining strange for chickens is admittedly difficult, weather might be changing. If the sunset looked particularly vivid, make sure you had extra firewood handy. But nothing in anyone's experience prepared them for what was about to happen. New Englanders were tough and resourceful, and had survived plenty of harsh winters. They'd seen big snowstorms before. They thought they knew what winter could throw at them. They were about to discover they'd been underestimating winter's ambitions. Picture yourself in your colonial home on February 27th, 1717. You wake before dawn, as usual, to coax the fire back to life. The house is cold enough that you can see your breath, which is so normal you barely notice anymore. You pull on your warmest clothes, and in colonial times this meant layers of wool, linen and leather that made you look like a medieval knight made of fabric, and begin the day's endless round of chores. But something feels different this morning. The air has that peculiar weight it gets before a significant storm, a pressure that makes your ears feel slightly odd and gives the world a muted quality. The wind, which has been a constant companion all winter, has gone still in a way that feels less peaceful and more like nature holding its breath. By midday, the first flakes begin to fall. Nothing dramatic initially, just a gentle dusting that looks almost pretty against the grey sky. You've seen this hundreds of times before. Snow in February is about as surprising as finding out water is wet. You note it, make sure you have enough firewood close to the house, and continue with your day. But the snow doesn't stop. Hour after hour, it continues with a steadiness that begins to seem almost purposeful. By evening, you've got several inches of fresh accumulation, and the snow is still falling with no sign of letting up. You bank the fire carefully before bed, make sure everyone is under enough blankets, and think that tomorrow you'll need to do some shoveling. When you wake the next morning, your first clue that something unusual is happening comes from the quality of light in the house. It's too bright for dawn, a strange diffused glow that seems to come from everywhere and nowhere. When you finally manage to open your door, and this takes effort pushing against resistance that shouldn't be there, you discover why. The snow has piled against your door in drifts that reach past your knees. The world outside has been transformed into an alien landscape of white, where familiar shapes have become strange, rounded lumps, and the horizon has disappeared into a curtain of falling snow. The storm that started yesterday hasn't stopped. If anything, it's intensified. This is the beginning of what contemporary accounts would call the Great Snow of 1717, though people living through it probably had other, less polite names for it. What New Englanders couldn't have known was that they were experiencing something meteorologically extraordinary. A series of 4 massive storms that would arrive in waves over the next 3 weeks, each adding to accumulations that were already unprecedented. The snow fell with a relentlessness that began to feel almost personal. Not in violent gusts and dramatic blizzard conditions, though there were certainly periods of that, but with a steady, implacable determination. It was as if the sky had decided that New England needed a really thorough covering and wasn't going to stop until the job was done properly. You can imagine the progression of reactions among colonial families. Day 1. Well, this is a significant snowfall. Day 2, this is quite unusual. Day 3, this is becoming concerning. Day 4, this is absolutely unprecedented and possibly the end of the world. Day 5, if I have to spend one more day trapped in this house with these people, I'm going to lose my mind. The practical challenges began immediately. Your daily routine, which was already demanding, suddenly required 3 times as much effort. Every trip to the barn to feed animals meant wading through snow that reached your thighs, then higher, then eventually to your chest. Paths that you shoveled one day were filled in by the next morning. The livestock, trapped in their shelters, needed constant attention to prevent them from panicking or worse, freezing. Firewood, which you'd carefully stacked within easy reach of the house, became buried under drifts. Digging it out was exhausting work in the best of times. Doing it while snow continued to fall and wind created drifts that seemed to appear out of nowhere was like some kind of very cold, very tiring meditation on futility. Yet it had to be done, because without fire your family would freeze. The mathematics of survival became starkly simple: dig or die. The psychological impact of being trapped indoors during an endless snowstorm is something modern people with heated homes, electricity and streaming services can barely imagine. You're confined to a space roughly the size of a modern living room and kitchen combined, with your entire family, with no entertainment beyond conversation, handwork and staring at the fire. The walls seem to close in. Small irritations become major grievances. That thing your spouse does when they chew, which you've tolerated for years, suddenly becomes unbearable. Children, bless them, handled confinement with all the grace and patience that children have possessed throughout human history, which is to say, none at all. They were restless, bored, fighting with siblings, and asking approximately every 10 minutes when they could go outside. Parents responded with the timeless patience of people who were also losing their minds, but had to pretend they weren't because civilization depended on maintaining standards. The storms came in waves, each separated by just enough time for people to think maybe it was over, only to watch the sky darken again and the snow resume. Contemporary accounts describe the snow as coming in 4 great storms over the course of about 3 weeks, but the distinction between separate storms probably felt academic when you were living through what seemed like one continuous siege by winter. Between storms, the sun might break through, illuminating a transformed landscape. Everything familiar had been reshaped by snow into strange flowing forms. Fences disappeared entirely under drifts. Trees bent under the weight of snow until their branches touched the ground, creating natural tunnels. Houses all but vanished, with only their chimneys protruding above the white expanse like stone fingers reaching for the sky. The drifts were what made this snowfall truly extraordinary. Wind had sculpted the snow into formations that defied logic. 10 feet deep in some places, bare ground in others, and waves and curves that looked like a frozen ocean. You could walk across the top of some drifts while sinking to your armpits in others just a few feet away. The surface would sometimes support your weight and sometimes not, and there was no reliable way to tell which would happen until you tested it. Animals suffered terribly during these storms. Cows trapped in barns needed constant care to prevent them from overheating in their confined space, while simultaneously ensuring they didn't freeze. Chickens stopped laying entirely and seemed personally affronted by the weather, as if someone had promised them spring and then welched on the deal. Horses and oxen, usually stoic about weather, showed clear signs of distress at being confined for days on end. Wild animals fared even worse. Deer, trapped by snow too deep to navigate, either starved or became easy prey for wolves and other predators that could travel on top of the crusted snow. Birds that hadn't migrated found food scarce and shelter hard to come by. The forest went silent in a way that was eerie. No birdsong, no rustling of small animals, just the whisper of falling snow and the occasional crack of a branch breaking under accumulated weight. The harbour in Boston froze solid, something that happened occasionally but always felt ominous. Ships were trapped in ice. their masts visible above the white expanse like a bare forest. The ice was thick enough to walk on, though only the foolhardy or desperate tried it. The ocean, that vast presence that defined so much of New England life, temporarily became just another snowfield. Food stores that had seemed adequate in January began to look alarmingly insufficient by mid-March. You were burning through firewood faster than planned because you needed to keep the fire going constantly. Animals were eating hay at their normal rate, but the hay was getting harder to reach. Every meal required careful calculation, and families began to worry about what would happen if the snow didn't stop soon. Yet there was also a strange beauty to it all. On clear nights between storms, the moonlight on endless snow created a luminescence that turned the world into something magical. The silence was profound. No wagon wheels on roads, no church bells carrying from distant towns, just a hush so complete it almost rang in your ears. The stars seemed brighter somehow, as if the snow reflected light back to the sky. Some people found the experience almost meditative, forced as they were to slow down and exist in the immediate moment. There were no trips to town, no visits with neighbours, and no church meetings. Life contracted to the essentials: keep the fire burning, feed your family, care for your animals, and wait. In a world normally filled with constant labour and social obligations, this enforced pause had an odd appeal, at least for the first week or so. But as the snow continued, as drifts grew higher and supplies grew lower, as the novelty wore off and the reality of the situation set in, that initial sense of wonder gave way to something closer to anxiety. This wasn't just a big snowstorm anymore. This was something different, something that was rewriting what New Englanders thought possible. The snow had been falling for over 2 weeks. The drifts in some places were measuring 15, 18, or even 20 feet deep. Houses were buried to their second stories, and the snow was still falling. By the time March arrived, New England had been transformed into an alien landscape that bore little resemblance to the world colonists had known. Imagine stepping out your door, assuming you could open it, and finding yourself standing on top of what used to be your roof. This wasn't an exaggeration for many families. The snow had piled so high that second-story windows were at ground level, and chimneys required constant attention to prevent them from being completely buried. Daily life had become a series of adaptations to absurd circumstances. You didn't walk anywhere, you tunneled. Families created networks of passages through the snow connecting their houses to barns, wells, and wood piles. These tunnels were engineering projects worthy of miners, requiring constant maintenance as snow shifted and settled. Some colonists described their tunnels collapsing while they were in them, leading to panicked digging and a newfound appreciation for open spaces. The tunnels created a strange new architecture of necessity. You descend from your door into a passage whose walls were compressed snow, dimly lit by whatever sunlight penetrated from above. The tunnel would branch, one direction to the barn, another to the well, and a third to the woodpile. Walking through these passages felt like being a very cold mole, and the disorientation of being surrounded by snow on all sides took some getting used to. Feeding animals became an expedition. You'd suit up in every piece of warm clothing you owned, grab whatever tools you needed, light a lantern, and descend into your tunnel system. The trip to the barn that normally took 30 seconds now took 15 minutes. Once there, you'd need to deal with animals that were restless from confinement, nervous from the strange muffled quality of sound through snow, and generally unhappy about their circumstances. Getting water was perhaps the most challenging daily task. Wells that weren't buried had to be accessed through tunnels, and hauling water back through narrow passages while trying not to spill was an exercise in patience and balance. Some families resorted to melting snow, which sounds simple until you realise how much snow you need to melt to get a usable amount of water, and how much firewood that requires, and how your firewood supplies are already stretched thin. Food preparation became creative out of necessity. Your variety had been limited before the storms. Now it was approaching monotonous. Root vegetables, salted meat, dried beans, and perhaps some preserved fruit if you were lucky. Every meal was a variation on the theme of things that can be boiled or roasted near the fire. The bright spot was that at least you didn't have to worry about food spoiling. You could just stick it in a snowbank, which was basically a giant natural freezer that covered everything you owned. Children's education, such as it was, continued sporadically. Parents who could read would work with their children on basic literacy and arithmetic, using the Bible, almanacs, and whatever other books the family owned. But concentration was difficult when everyone was cold, irritable, and worried about their increasingly precarious situation. Lessons often devolved into storytelling, which at least passed the time and didn't require anyone to sit still and focus. The psychological strain of prolonged confinement manifested in various ways. Some people became withdrawn and quiet, staring into the fire for hours. Others became manic in their activity, finding endless small tasks to occupy themselves. Family dynamics that had been stable for years suddenly became fraught. The colonial period didn't have therapists or self-help books, so people just had to cope using prayer, alcohol, or sheer stubbornness. Interestingly, the forced isolation seemed to reduce religious attendance anxieties. Getting to church was physically impossible for most families, which meant missing services without any guilt. The Puritan ministers, who usually took a dim view of absence, were presumably too busy dealing with their own snow-related problems to worry much about who wasn't showing up. It was possibly the first time in colonial New England history that you could skip church without social consequences. Neighbours who could see each other's chimneys through the snow, often the only indication that other humans were nearby, developed signalling systems. Smoke patterns could convey basic information. We're okay, we need help, and does anyone have any spare candles because we're running out? And staring into darkness for 12 hours a night is making us strange. These smoke signals were probably not terribly sophisticated, but they provided reassurance that you weren't completely alone in the white wilderness. The mail, such as it existed in 1717, completely stopped. There were no postal workers brave or foolish enough to attempt delivery through 20-foot snowdrifts. This meant that communities became isolated not just physically, but also informationally. You had no idea what was happening in the next town, let alone in Boston or other major settlements. For all you knew, you were the only people left alive, and the rest of New England had been consumed by snow. Animals developed their own coping strategies. Chickens trapped in coops established new pecking orders based on who could commandeer the warmest spots. Cows adapted to their confinement with bovine stoicism, though their milk production dropped significantly. Horses seemed to understand the gravity of the situation and became unusually cooperative, perhaps sensing that everyone needed to work together to survive. The few people who attempted travel during this period left accounts that sound like expeditions to the Arctic. One man described walking to his neighbour's house, a journey of perhaps a quarter mile that took him 3 hours. He had to navigate drifts, break through crusted snow, backtrack when he encountered impassable barriers, and generally experience an adventure worthy of a polar explorer. His neighbour, apparently surprised to see anyone, greeted him like he'd returned from a voyage to the moon. Some enterprising colonists discovered that the hard-packed surface of the drifts could support considerable weight if approached correctly. You could walk on top of snow that in other spots would swallow you completely. This led to a strange new form of travel where you'd move cautiously across the surface, testing each step, moving like someone walking on thin ice because, in essence, you were. The technique required practice, patience, and acceptance that you'd occasionally fall through and need to be pulled out. The soundscape of life under the drifts was distinctive. Normal outdoor sounds were muffled by the snow, creating an eerie quiet broken only by the occasional crack of breaking branches, the muffled lowing of cattle, or the scrape of shovels as people fought to maintain their tunnel systems. Inside homes, every sound seemed amplified, the pop of the fire, the creak of floorboards, and the breathing of family members. Some people found the quiet soothing, others found it oppressive. Lighting became a precious commodity. Candles, which were already expensive and time-consuming to make, burned down steadily while the snow showed no signs of stopping. Families rationed light carefully, often going to bed shortly after sunset to conserve candles for when they were truly necessary. Evenings were spent in semi-darkness, with perhaps one candle or the firelight to see by, creating shadows that danced on walls and made familiar rooms seem strange. The creativity of desperate people manifested in unexpected ways. Some families organised indoor festivals to maintain morale, singing, storytelling, crafts, anything to break the monotony. Children created elaborate games using household objects. Adults told stories from memory, embellishing with each retelling until they became local legends. One family reportedly performed an entire week's worth of evening entertainments using nothing but shadow puppets and ingenuity. Health concerns added another layer of anxiety. If someone got sick or injured during the snowstorm, there was no way to fetch a doctor, no way to get help from neighbours, and no options except to deal with it yourself using whatever folk remedies and herbal knowledge you possessed. Every cough made parents nervous. Every complaint of feeling unwell triggered calculations about supplies of medicinal herbs and whether the situation might become serious. Surprisingly, the death rate during the Great Snow, at least among humans, was relatively low. New Englanders were tough, resourceful, and experienced in dealing with harsh conditions. They knew how to ration food, maintain heat efficiently, and keep themselves occupied during long periods of confinement. The bigger casualties were livestock, particularly those in less sturdy shelters or with inadequate food stores. As March progressed and the snow finally stopped falling, colonists began to reckon with the full extent of what had happened. The accumulation in most places measured between 10 and 20 feet, with drifts in exposed areas reaching 25 feet or more. Houses were buried. Roads had ceased to exist as recognisable features. The landscape looked like someone had taken a giant white blanket and just dropped it over everything, smoothing out all the familiar contours into alien curves and slopes. The silence when the snow stopped was somehow more profound than the silence during the storms. For weeks there had been at least the soft whisper of falling flakes and the occasional gust of wind. Now there was nothing. The world held its breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Birds that had survived began to tentatively explore, their calls sounding impossibly loud in the stillness. The sun emerged from behind clouds, making the snow surface sparkle so brightly it hurt to look at directly. When the snow finally stopped falling in mid-March, New Englanders faced a new problem. They were living under approximately 20 feet of frozen water that showed no immediate interest in going anywhere. Spring in New England typically involves a gradual thaw, with melting during the day and refreezing at night, a slow transition from winter to mud season. But the Great Snow wasn't interested in following typical patterns. The sheer volume of snow created its own microclimate. Even as temperatures rose above freezing during the day, the vast mass of snow stayed cold, reflecting sunlight and keeping air temperatures lower than they might otherwise be. It was like living inside a massive ice cube that was very slowly warming from the outside in. The process of melting this much snow would take weeks, possibly months, and would create its own set of challenges. Initial attempts at clearing paths were almost comically futile. You'd shovel for hours, creating a narrow passage that represented significant effort and exhaustion, only to realise you'd made a barely visible dent in drifts that stretched in every direction. It was like trying to empty a lake with a teacup. Some colonists gave up on clearing entirely and just focused on maintaining their tunnel systems, figuring the snow would melt eventually and there was no point in fighting it. But isolation was becoming a serious problem. Communities had been cut off from each other for over 3 weeks. Food supplies were running critically low. Firewood that had seemed adequate in February was nearly exhausted. People needed to reconnect, needed to trade goods, and needed to know if the rest of the world still existed. This necessity drove remarkable efforts to create pathways through the snow. The solution that emerged was essentially a combination of tunnelling and tramping. Groups of men would work together to create packed-down trails, walking the same path repeatedly until it was compressed enough to support regular traffic. It was exhausting work, Imagine hiking through deep snow for hours while carrying tools. But gradually, slowly, paths began to connect neighbouring farms and eventually link to main roads. These early pathways were more like trenches than roads. You'd walk along the bottom of a corridor whose walls were snow, sometimes 15 feet high on either side, unable to see anything but the sky above and the path ahead. It was disorienting and slightly claustrophobic, but it was better than complete isolation. Travellers met in these trenches with the relief of survivors finding other humans after a disaster, exchanging news and supplies and reassurances that they weren't alone. Boston, being a port city with more resources and manpower, organised more systematic clearing efforts. Teams of workers attacked the snow with a determination born of economic necessity. The city's commerce depended on ship traffic, and ships couldn't move while the harbour was frozen and streets were impassable. The work was brutal, shoveling snow all day in conditions that ranged from barely tolerable to actively hostile. But wages were good by colonial standards, and desperation made many willing to take on the task. The clearing efforts in Boston created mountains of snow that had to go somewhere. Without modern snow removal equipment, the only option was to pile it up. These artificial hills of ploughed snow grew taller than buildings, creating a strange new cityscape where snow mountains loomed over streets. Children found these mountains irresistible for sledding, despite parental warnings about the dangers. Some of these snow piles would remain visible well into summer, slowly shrinking but stubbornly refusing to disappear entirely. Rural areas relied more on nature to do the work. As temperatures gradually warmed, the snow began to settle and compress under its own weight. Paths that had been impassable slowly became navigable as the surface hardened and lowered. It was still difficult travel. You'd sink to your knees or thighs with regularity, but it was at least possible to move around your property and reach nearby neighbours. The livestock situation was becoming critical. Animals that had survived this long-needed fresh air, exercise and grazing as soon as possible. But releasing them into deep snow risked losing them in drifts or having them injure themselves trying to navigate impossible terrain. Farmers had to create enclosed areas near barns, where snow was compressed enough for animals to move safely. Horses and oxen were particularly valuable and received the most careful attention, while chickens were basically left to fend for themselves, which they did with their usual combination of luck and spite. As communication resumed, people discovered that the Great Snow had affected all of New England with varying degrees of severity. Some coastal areas had received less accumulation, while inland regions and higher elevations were buried even deeper than most places. Stories began to circulate, tales of whole houses being lost until spring, of travellers who perished attempting to cross impossible distances, of creative solutions to unprecedented problems. One story that made the rounds involved a family whose chimney became so packed with snow that smoke couldn't escape. Rather than suffocate, they carefully extinguished their fire and spent several days in bitter cold while working to clear the chimney from inside. When they finally succeeded and relit the fire, the sudden draft nearly blew the roof off. The family survived, the house survived, and they became local celebrities for their ordeal. Another account described a man who'd been visiting neighbours when the worst of the storms hit. Unable to return home, he was trapped for nearly 3 weeks. His wife, assuming he'd taken shelter somewhere, wasn't particularly worried until he finally made it back, half-starved and with a beard that had grown wild. She reportedly greeted him with relief, then immediately put him to work on clearing their paths, because priorities. The gradual reconnection of communities brought news both good and troubling. The death toll, while lower than might be expected given the severity of the storms, was still significant. Mostly elderly people who couldn't handle the cold, a few travellers caught between destinations, and some children who wandered from safety. Livestock losses were substantial. Estimates suggested that hundreds of cattle, sheep, and other animals had died from cold, starvation, or injuries sustained in panicked attempts to escape their shelters. But there was also remarkable news of resilience and survival. Families who had been certain they wouldn't make it through had found ways to endure. Communities that had seemed on the brink of crisis discovered they had more resources and creativity than they'd realised. The shared experience of surviving something unprecedented created bonds between neighbours that would last for generations. Religious leaders interpreted the Great Snow according to their theological frameworks. Some saw it as divine punishment for colonial sins, though there was considerable debate about which specific sins had angered God enough to warrant 20 feet of snow. Others viewed it as a test of faith, a trial that would strengthen the community's relationship with the divine. A few practical-minded ministers suggested it was simply weather, and perhaps they should focus on helping each other rather than debating its spiritual significance. As March gave way to April, the pace of melting accelerated. Warmer temperatures and longer days finally began to make a visible dent in the snow accumulation. Roofs emerged from under their white burden. Fences reappeared. Trees that had been bent double slowly straightened as their load of snow melted. The landscape began to remember its original shape, though it would be weeks before it fully returned to normal. The melting created its own set of problems. All that snow had to go somewhere, and where it went was everywhere. Rivers and streams swelled to flood stage. Roads turned into muddy rivers. Basements flooded. The spring runoff, typically a manageable annual event, became a deluge that overwhelmed normal drainage and created temporary lakes in low-lying areas. It was like watching winter turn directly into a very wet, very muddy version of spring, skipping all the pleasant parts. But with the melting came hope. Every day the world looked a little more familiar. Every day travel became a little easier. Every day brought them closer to the farming season, when they could begin to recover from winter's assault. Gardens could be planned, animals could graze, and normal life could resume. The first flowers to emerge, crocuses and snowdrops ironically, became objects of celebration disproportionate to their size or beauty. After months of nothing but white and grey and brown, the sight of actual colour in the landscape felt like a miracle. Children brought handfuls of early flowers to their mothers, who placed them in whatever containers could hold water, treating them like precious treasures. Birds returned in force, and their songs seemed louder and more enthusiastic than anyone remembered. Or perhaps it was just that after weeks of muffled silence under snow, any sound felt remarkable. The geese flying overhead in their V formations, the robins hunting for worms in newly exposed soil, the hawks circling above looking for prey, all of it signalled that the world was returning to its normal rhythms. As spring truly arrived, and life returned to something approaching normal, New Englanders began to reckon with what the Great Snow had done to their world. The physical impacts were obvious: damaged buildings, lost livestock, and depleted supplies. But the psychological and social impacts would resonate for much longer. The Great Snow became the defining event against which all other weather was measured for generations. Grandparents would tell their grandchildren about the winter when the snow reached the second-story windows, and the children would roll their eyes the way children always do when elderly relatives start talking about how much harder things were in their day. Except in this case, the elderly relatives were actually telling the truth, even if they embellished the details with each retelling. Diaries and letters from 1717 provide glimpses into how people processed their experience. Cotton Mather, the famous Puritan minister, wrote extensively about the storms, interpreting them through a religious lens while also providing detailed meteorological observations. His accounts describe snow depths, drift patterns, and the challenges of daily life with the precision of someone who understood this was historically significant. Other written records are more personal and immediate. One woman wrote about the strange intimacy of being confined with her family for weeks, how they learned things about each other that years of normal life had never revealed. Another described the terror of hearing the roof creak under the weight of snow, wondering if each creak might be the one that preceded collapse. A farmer catalogued his livestock losses with the resignation of someone who understood that survival sometimes meant accepting things you couldn't control. The economic impact of the Great Snow rippled through New England for months. Spring planting was delayed, which meant smaller harvests in the fall. Lost livestock had to be replaced, a significant expense for families whose margins were already thin. Buildings needed repairs. Gardens that had been carefully established over years were damaged or destroyed and needed to be started from scratch. The snow had essentially reset progress for many families, forcing them to rebuild what had been lost. But there were unexpected benefits as well. The deep snowpack meant exceptional water availability through the summer. Wells that sometimes ran low stayed full. Streams that occasionally dried up kept flowing. The moisture in the soil produced crops that, despite the late start, grew with unusual vigour. Nature, having delivered an unprecedented winter, apparently decided to compensate with an uncommonly productive growing season. The shared experience of surviving the great snow created social bonds that transcended previous divisions. Disputes between neighbours seemed petty in light of what everyone had endured together. Communities that had been fractious found new unity. People who had survived the same ordeal developed a kinship that came from understanding what it meant to face nature at its most imposing and come through the other side. Children who lived through the great snow would carry its memory for the rest of their lives. For them, it became the dividing line between before and after, the event that marked their transition from childhood innocence to an understanding that the world could be both beautiful and dangerous. Some would develop a lifelong wariness of winter, always preparing more than necessary, always worried that another such storm might arrive. Others would remember it with a strange nostalgia, recalling the adventure and excitement of living through something extraordinary. The physical evidence of the great snow lasted surprisingly long. Those massive piles of ploughed snow in Boston melted slowly through the summer, creating muddy pools that became unofficial swimming holes for children and nuisances for everyone else. Some snow remained in deep, shaded valleys well into June, stubborn patches of winter refusing to admit that spring had won. Trees that had been damaged by the weight of snow bore scars visible for years afterward. Bent trunks, missing branches, and growth patterns that marked where they'd been broken and healed. Architecture changed subtly in response to the great snow. New buildings were constructed with steeper roofs to shed snow more effectively. Barns were reinforced with additional supports. Storage buildings were designed with better access during high snow conditions. These weren't dramatic changes, but they reflected a recalibration of what New Englanders understood winter could do. They'd been reminded that nature could exceed their expectations, and they adjusted their plans accordingly. The great snow entered folklore almost immediately. Stories began to circulate that probably had some basis in truth, but grew more elaborate with each telling. Tales of people walking over houses without realizing they were there. Accounts of deer being found frozen in standing positions, preserved in ice like statues. Stories of tunnels collapsing and miraculous rescues. Of supplies running out just as a thaw allowed resupply. Of providential interventions that saved families from disaster. Some stories focused on human ingenuity and creativity under pressure. The man who fashioned snowshoes from barrel staves and managed to walk across drifts that swallowed everyone else. The family that rationed their food so carefully they ended the ordeal with supplies to spare. The woman who kept her family's spirits up through the darkest days with nothing but stories and songs. These tales celebrated the resilience and resourcefulness that had allowed the community to survive. Other stories had a darker tone, acknowledging the losses and the moments of despair. The traveller was found frozen halfway between settlements, his final thoughts unknown. The elderly couple who simply didn't have the strength to endure another month of cold and hardship. The animals that died despite their owners' best efforts. These stories served as reminders that survival had come at a cost, and that luck played as much a role as preparation or strength. The Great Snow also entered religious discourse in ways that reflected the theological debates of the era. Some ministers used it as evidence of divine displeasure, pointing to specific sins they believed had triggered God's judgment. Others saw it as a test that the community had passed, evidence of their faith and righteousness. Still others argued it was simply weather, remarkable but natural, and that attributing moral significance to meteorology was perhaps missing the point. These debates probably mattered less to the average colonist than the practical question of whether their chickens would start laying again. Scientific observation in the early 18th century was informal and often mixed with folklore, but the Great Snow prompted some genuine attempts to understand what had happened. People compared experiences, trying to establish patterns in snowfall and drift formation. They noticed that certain areas consistently received more or less snow, that wind patterns created predictable drift locations, and that temperature fluctuations influenced snow quality. This informal meteorology wouldn't impress modern scientists, but it represented colonists trying to make sense of their world through observation and reason. The Great Snow's legacy extended beyond New England. News of the extraordinary winter spread to other colonies and eventually to England, where it was received with a mixture of sympathy and scepticism. English readers, accustomed to milder winters, struggled to imagine 20 feet of snow. Some assumed the accounts were exaggerated. Surely the colonists were embellishing for effect. This scepticism frustrated New Englanders, who knew exactly how extraordinary their experience had been and resented having it questioned by people who'd never seen snow that deep. In the decades that followed, the Great Snow became a benchmark. Other harsh winters were compared to it and found wanting. Bad, but not 1717 bad, became a common refrain. The event established a ceiling for what winter could do, a worst-case scenario that seemed unlikely to be repeated. And indeed, while New England has experienced many harsh winters since 1717, none have quite matched that remarkable season when the sky opened and didn't close for nearly a month. As you sit here in your climate-controlled comfort, perhaps with a warm drink and a soft blanket, it's worth reflecting on what the Great Snow can teach us about resilience, community, and the human relationship with nature. We're separated from those colonial New Englanders by over 3 centuries, countless technological advances, and such dramatic changes in daily life that they'd barely recognise our world. Yet their experience speaks to something timeless about how people cope with circumstances beyond their control. The colonists of 1717 didn't have weather forecasting, climate control, instant communication, or any of the technologies we consider essential for dealing with harsh weather. What they had was knowledge passed down through generations, strong community bonds, a remarkable tolerance for discomfort, and an understanding that survival sometimes meant simply enduring. When faced with unprecedented circumstances, they adapted, improvised, and supported each other through the crisis. There's something almost enviable about the simplicity of their challenges. Not enviable in the sense that we'd want to experience what they did, spending weeks trapped in a cold house with inadequate food, while buried under 20 feet of snow sounds terrible no matter how you frame it, but enviable in its directness. The problems were clear: stay warm, stay fed, keep animals alive, and wait for spring. The solutions, while difficult, were equally clear. There was no ambiguity about what needed doing. Modern life rarely offers such clarity. Our challenges are often abstract, long-term, and difficult to define precisely. Climate change, economic uncertainty, social division, these are the storms we face now, and they don't have the simple directness of too much snow. We can't tunnel through them or wait for them to melt. The colonists who survived the Great Snow had the advantage of knowing their ordeal had a definite endpoint. Eventually spring would arrive and the snow would melt. They just had to last until then, but perhaps we can learn something from how they approached their crisis. They didn't waste energy complaining about the injustice of their situation, or debating whether the snow was really that deep, or speculating about whether better leadership could have prevented it. They accepted the reality they faced and focused on what they could control: their own actions, their family's welfare, and their neighbours' needs. There's wisdom in that acceptance, in choosing to work with reality rather than arguing with it. The community bonds strengthened by the Great Snow offer another lesson. Modern society often prioritises individual achievement and self-sufficiency in ways that colonial New Englanders would find both bizarre and dangerous. They understood that survival depended on community, on neighbours helping each other, and on sharing resources and knowledge and labour. The Great Snow reinforced these bonds by making their importance undeniable. You survived not just through your own efforts, but through the web of relationships that connected you to others. We've built a world where such interdependence is less visible. Your heat comes from distant power plants or gas lines. Your food comes from industrial farms hundreds or thousands of miles away. Your water arrives through underground pipes from treatment facilities you've never seen. This system is remarkably efficient, but it obscures the reality that we're just as dependent on others as those colonial families were. We've just outsourced that dependence to systems so large and complex that we forget they're there until they fail. The Great Snow also reminds us of nature's power and indifference. The storms didn't care about human plans or needs or survival. They weren't punishment or tests or lessons. They were weather, operating according to atmospheric physics that has no concern for whether humans find the results convenient. Colonial New Englanders understood this at a visceral level that modern people often don't. They lived much closer to nature's raw power and had fewer buffers between themselves and its effects. Our technology has given us unprecedented ability to predict, prepare for, and protect ourselves from natural events. We have weather satellites, climate models, building codes, emergency services, and infrastructure designed to handle extreme conditions. These are real advantages that save countless lives. But they can also create an illusion of control that doesn't match reality. Nature retains the ability to overwhelm our preparations as hurricanes, floods, wildfires, and yes, occasionally severe winter storms continue to demonstrate. There's also something to be said about the pace of life the Great Snow enforced. For weeks, colonists had nothing to do but exist with their families, maintain basic necessities, and wait. No rushing to appointments, no checking devices, no consuming media, no busy work that creates the illusion of productivity. Just being in the most fundamental sense. Many people who've experienced similar forced slowing, whether through illness, isolation, or circumstance, report that while difficult, it provided unexpected insights and a recalibration of priorities. The stories that emerge from the Great Snow highlight humanity's need to make meaning from experience. People didn't just survive the storms, they needed to understand them, to fit them into narratives that made sense of their world. Some narratives were religious, others practical, and still others focused on human heroism or failure. What matters isn't which interpretation was correct, but that creating these stories helped people process their experience and pass its lessons to future generations. In our own era of rapid change and uncertainty, we're creating similar stories to make sense of our experiences. We argue about their meaning, their implications, and their lessons. Like those colonial New Englanders, we're trying to understand events that exceed our previous frameworks for comprehension. Their arguments about whether the Great Snow was divine judgment or natural weather mirror are debates about current challenges. We're all just trying to make sense of things that don't fit comfortably into our existing understanding. The Great Snow's eventual end offers perhaps the most important lesson. Hard times do end. Spring did arrive. The snow did melt. Life did return to normal, or at least to a new normal shaped by the experience. For people in the midst of crisis, this can be hard to believe. When you're trapped under 20 feet of snow with dwindling supplies and no certain end date, it's difficult to maintain faith that better days are coming. But they came anyway, as they generally do. This isn't empty optimism or toxic positivity. It's simply an observation based on history. Humans are remarkably good at surviving difficult circumstances, adapting to new realities, and rebuilding after disasters. We've done it countless times, in countless places, facing challenges that seemed insurmountable until they were surmounted. The colonists who survived the Great Snow didn't have any special abilities we lack. They were ordinary people who found themselves in extraordinary circumstances and did what needed doing until the circumstances changed. As we come to the end of our journey through that remarkable winter, it's time to settle deeper into your comfortable spot. and let the story find its resting place in your mind. The Great Snow of 1717 happened over 3 centuries ago, but its lessons remain as relevant as fresh snowfall. Those colonial families, living through week after week of isolation and uncertainty, probably didn't feel particularly heroic. They felt cold, tired, worried, and thoroughly sick of being trapped indoors with the same people eating the same food and having the same conversations. Heroism, like most important human qualities, is usually just ordinary people doing what needs doing without much thought about how it looks to others or history. The physical evidence of the Great Snow has long since melted away. The drifts that seem permanent proved as temporary as all snow eventually must be. The damage was repaired, the losses mourned and moved past, and the extraordinary slowly absorbed into ordinary life's continuing flow. What remains are the stories, passed down and reshaped with each generation, and the quiet knowledge that humans can endure remarkably difficult circumstances when necessary. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep in your warm bed, you might spare a thought for those colonial families huddled around their fires, waiting for a winter that seemed endless to finally release its grip. They made it through, spring arrived, life continued. The snow, despite its overwhelming presence, was ultimately just weather, and weather always changes eventually. There's comfort in that persistence, in the knowledge that difficult times pass and seasons change, and life finds ways to continue. The Great Snow was exceptional, but what's truly remarkable is how people lived through it, not through any special magic or supernatural intervention, but through the ordinary magic of human resilience, community support, and simple, stubborn refusal to give up. Sleep well, knowing that whatever storms we face in our own lives, spring does eventually arrive. The snow does melt. The world does return to green and growth and warmth. And the stories we tell about how we survived become part of the continuous human narrative that stretches from those colonial families to us, and from us to whoever will listen to these tales in centuries to come. The Great Snow of 1717 is waiting for you in dreams, if you want to visit. All that white silence, all that forced stillness, all those small human moments of survival and community and endurance. But you're experiencing it from the warm side of history, which is exactly where you should be. Rest easy. Tomorrow will come, as it always does, bringing whatever weather it brings. And if you wake to find snow outside your own window, you can smile knowing it probably won't reach the second story. Probably. You're settling in for the night, probably checking your phone one last time, adjusting your pillow just so, maybe wondering if you remembered to set your alarm. But imagine for a moment that you're living 4,000 years ago, and your bedroom is a cramped wooden hut that smells like smoke and wet wool. Your bed, a pile of straw that's seen better days, and your alarm clock is the rooster next door who apparently never learned the concept of sleeping in. Welcome to the Bronze Age, when getting a good night's sleep was about as reliable as your Wi-Fi during a thunderstorm. You'd think that after a long day of hacking away at copper veins deep underground, these ancient miners would collapse into bed like exhausted teenagers. But here's where things get interesting, and a little weird. These weren't your typical 9-to-5 workers. They had developed sleep patterns that would make a modern sleep specialist scratch their head and possibly recommend therapy. Picture this. You're a Bronze Age miner named, well, let's call you Copper Arm. Names were simpler back then. You've just spent 12 hours underground in what can only be described as a very expensive cave, breathing air that would make a coal plant jealous, and your back feels like you've been carrying a mammoth uphill. Naturally, you'd want to sleep for about 14 hours straight, but instead you're lying on your straw bed staring at the ceiling, which is probably just more straw, completely unable to drift off. Your mind is racing with thoughts like, did I remember to shore up that tunnel? And, was that creaking sound the mine settling? Or is it about to become my tomb? These weren't exactly the kind of counting sheep thoughts that lead to peaceful slumber. The Bronze Age mining communities had discovered something that modern science is only now catching up to. When your daily survival depends on not being crushed by tons of rock, your brain doesn't exactly embrace the concept of letting its guard down. sleep became this strange dance between exhaustion and hypervigilance, like trying to nap while riding a roller coaster. What's fascinating is how these ancient miners adapted. They didn't have sleep studies or melatonin supplements, or those white noise machines that sound like gentle rain but somehow cost more than your monthly coffee budget. Instead, they developed their own peculiar strategies that were part practical, part superstitious, and entirely human. Some miners would sleep in shifts, not because they were working around the clock, but because they'd discovered that sleeping alone made every little sound feel like impending doom. So they'd rotate who was on watch, even while sleeping, taking turns being the designated light sleeper. It was like having a buddy system for unconsciousness. Others developed what we might call preparation rituals that would make your bedtime routine look minimalist. They'd spend an hour arranging their tools in specific patterns around their sleeping area, not for easy access, but because the familiar ritual helped calm their overactive minds. Imagine explaining to your spouse that you need to arrange your laptop, coffee mug, and reading glasses in a perfect triangle before you can possibly fall asleep. But perhaps the most intriguing adaptation was how these miners learned to embrace what we'd now call fragmented sleep. Instead of fighting their tendency to wake up every few hours in a panic, they built their rest around it. They'd sleep for a few hours, wake up naturally, usually convinced something terrible was about to happen, spend an hour or two doing quiet activities like mending tools or planning the next day's work, then settle back down for another sleep cycle. This wasn't insomnia, it was evolution in action. Their bodies and minds were adapting to a lifestyle that required constant alertness even during rest. They were literally rewiring their sleep patterns to match their dangerous profession, creating a survival strategy disguised as a sleep disorder. And you thought your habit of checking your phone at 2 a.m. was problematic. Now here's where the story takes a turn that would make your afternoon coffee break look like child's play. You see, these Bronze Age miners had discovered something that modern workplace efficiency experts are still trying to figure out: the strategic underground nap. Picture yourself back in Copper Arm's well-worn boots, deep in a mine shaft that's lit by oil lamps that flicker more than your grandmother's old television. The air is thick, your muscles ache, and you've been swinging that bronze pickaxe for hours. Logic would suggest that the last thing you'd want to do is fall asleep surrounded by unstable rock walls and toxic fumes. But logic, as you're about to discover, wasn't exactly the miner's strong suit. These crafty underground workers had figured out that a well-timed 20-minute nap in the depths of the mine could be the difference between productive afternoon digging and accidentally pickaxing your own foot. But here's the catch, and this is where things get delightfully weird. They couldn't just curl up anywhere. Oh no, that would be too easy. Underground napping had rules, serious rules. The kind of rules that would make your office handbook look like a grocery list. First, you had to find what they called a singing spot, a place in the mine where the acoustics were just right. Not too echoey, which meant unstable rock, not too muffled, which could mean dangerous gas pockets, but just right, like some sort of geological Goldilocks situation. These spots were highly coveted, and miners would actually trade shifts and rations for access to the premium napping locations. Imagine the workplace politics. Listen, Tinbeard, I'll give you my extra bread ration and cover your morning shift if you let me have the Tuesday 2 p.m. slot in the good sleeping alcove. It was like booking a conference room, except the stakes were your sanity, and the conference room could potentially collapse on you. But the weirdness doesn't stop there. These miners had developed a buddy system for underground napping that was part safety protocol, part superstition. One person would sleep while another kept watch, not for cave-ins or dangerous gases, but for what they called the dream thieves. Now, before you start picturing some sort of Bronze Age sleep bandits sneaking around stealing dreams, let me explain. The miners believed that sleeping underground could lead to prophetic dreams about the location of rich ore veins. These dreams were considered so valuable that there were actual cases of miners trying to steal each other's sleeping spots to intercept these geological visions. It was like corporate espionage, but with more dirt and fewer PowerPoint presentations. The watching partner had a specific job. If the sleeping miner started mumbling about copper or tin or gold in their sleep, the watcher was supposed to memorize every word. Some watchers even developed their own shorthand for recording these drowsy proclamations. Imagine waking up from your nap to find your coworker frantically scribbling notes about your sleep-talking session. You said something about shiny veins near the singing water, your partner would whisper urgently. Do you remember what that means? And you'd be standing there, still groggy, trying to figure out if you'd just solved the mind's productivity problems or if you'd simply been dreaming about your lunch again. The really fascinating part is that this system actually worked. Not because the dreams were genuinely prophetic, but because the process of sleeping underground had actually trained these miners to be incredibly observant about subtle geological signs. Their subconscious minds were processing details they'd noticed during their waking hours: slight changes in rock colour, variations in airflow, unusual sounds or echoes. So when they dreamed about promising locations, they were actually accessing a kind of intuitive knowledge they'd built up through months or years of underground experience. It was like having a geological GPS system powered by REM sleep and Bronze Age intuition. But here's the mildly stressful part that would keep you on edge. Not everyone's dreams were welcome. If a miner's underground naps consistently led to dry holes or dangerous cave-ins, they'd be banned from the good sleeping spots. Imagine the pressure of knowing that your dream quality could affect your career prospects. Performance reviews were literally based on your subconscious performance. Sorry, Copperarm, but your last 3 dream tips led us to solid rock and a small flood. You're relegated to the noisy alcove near the ventilation shaft until further notice. It was like being demoted for your sleep performance. Talk about workplace stress following you into your dreams. You'd think that people who spent their days in near total darkness would relish the opportunity to sleep in actual comfortable darkness. But Bronze Age miners, as you're beginning to understand, weren't exactly conventional in their approach to rest and relaxation. Instead of embracing the darkness, they turned bedtime into what can only be described as a competitive sport. And like most competitive sports, it was simultaneously ridiculous and intensely serious. Picture this. You're back in your straw-filled hut after another day of underground adventures, and instead of simply lying down and closing your eyes like a reasonable person, you're participating in what the mining community called darkness challenges. These weren't official competitions with prizes and ceremonies. They were the kind of informal contests that emerge when people have too much time, too much stress, and not nearly enough entertainment options. The basic concept was simple. See who could fall asleep fastest in complete darkness. But like everything else in Bronze Age mining culture, the execution was wonderfully complicated. First, there were the preparation rituals. Each miner had their own pre-sleep routine that they swore was the key to rapid unconsciousness. Some would count their breathing in specific patterns, not the gentle 4-7-8 breathing you might have learned in yoga class, but intense mathematical sequences that would make your high school algebra teacher proud. Others would mentally catalogue every tool in their collection, every support beam in their section of the mine, every pebble in their daily path. One popular technique involved what they called reverse mining, mentally digging their way out of the mine tunnel by tunnel from their deepest point to the surface. It was like counting sheep, except the sheep were geological formations and the counting could take hours. But here's where the competitive element kicked in. Miners would actually time each other's descent into sleep. They'd use water clocks, basically ancient hourglasses filled with water instead of sand, to measure who could achieve unconsciousness most efficiently. The current record holder in most communities was usually treated with the kind of respect we might reserve for Olympic athletes. Did you hear? Stonejaw fell asleep in under 3 drips last night. 3 drips. I can barely get comfortable in under 10. This timing system led to all sorts of creative strategies. Some miners would deliberately exhaust themselves during the day, performing extra tasks or taking on additional shifts, thinking that extreme fatigue would guarantee rapid sleep. Others went the opposite direction, trying to achieve the perfect balance of tiredness without crossing into that overtired zone where your brain starts acting like a caffeinated squirrel. The really dedicated competitors developed what we might recognise as early meditation techniques. They'd spend their evening hours practicing what they called mind darkening, essentially training their thoughts to slow down and fade to black on command. It was mindfulness meditation disguised as a sleep competition, and it actually worked surprisingly well. But then there were the cheaters. Oh yes, even Bronze Age sleeping competitions had their scandals. Some miners would secretly consume fermented beverages before the challenge, figuring that alcohol-induced drowsiness should count as legitimate sleep speed. Others would claim they'd fallen asleep when they were actually just lying very still with their eyes closed, hoping the timekeeper wouldn't notice the difference. There were heated debates about whether these tactics were within the spirit of the competition. That's not real sleep, Copperarm. Real sleep means dream activity. You were just pretending. Prove it, Bronzetooth. You can't measure dreams with a water clock. These arguments would sometimes go on for hours, which kind of defeated the entire purpose of a rapid sleep competition. The most elaborate cheating scheme involved miners who would practice falling asleep during their lunch breaks, essentially training for the evening competitions like athletes preparing for the Olympics. They'd find quiet spots in the mine, set up their own timing systems, and work on perfecting their sleep-onset technique during work hours. This led to the somewhat stressful situation where supervisors had to watch for miners who were too good at falling asleep. If you could doze off too quickly during the day, you might be suspected of practicing for the evening competitions instead of focusing on your actual job. Why were you able to fall asleep so fast during lunch break, Tin Hand? Are you training for tonight's darkness challenge when you should be thinking about copper extraction? Imagine having to defend your natural sleepiness as evidence that you weren't being competitive about bedtime. It was like being too good at relaxation for your own good. The competitions also created an unexpected side effect. Miners became incredibly sensitive to sleep disruption. A snoring neighbour, a creaking roof beam, or an unusually active mouse could completely ruin your competitive sleep time. This led to elaborate pre-competition rituals involving soundproofing attempts, neighbour negotiations, and what can only be described as Bronze Age white noise machines, usually involving controlled water dripping or rhythmic tool tapping. And just when you thought it couldn't get more complicated, the communities started developing seasonal variations of the challenges, with different rules for winter sleeping versus summer sleeping, new moon versus full moon nights, and pre-mining versus post-mining sleep sessions. It was the kind of thing that started as simple fun and evolved into a complex subculture with its own rules, strategies, and social hierarchies. Because apparently, even sleep needed to be optimized for maximum efficiency and competitive advantage. Who knew Bronze Age miners were the original life hackers? Just when you thought Bronze Age sleep habits couldn't get any stranger, we encounter what might be the most peculiar phenomenon of all, the singing sleepers. And no, this isn't about miners who hummed lullabies to help themselves drift off, though that would be charmingly normal compared to what actually happened. You're lying in your Bronze Age bed. Remember, it's still that pile of straw that's definitely seen better days. And from somewhere in the darkness comes a sound that's part melody, part moan, and entirely mysterious. It's your neighbour, Bronzebeard, engaging in what the mining community called sleep singing, a phenomenon that was part medical condition, part social ritual, and entirely fascinating to everyone who witnessed it. Sleep singing wasn't like the occasional snoring or sleep talking that you might be familiar with. These weren't random mumbles or unconscious vocalizations. The singing sleepers produced elaborate melodic compositions while completely unconscious, often lasting for hours and featuring complex harmonies that they couldn't reproduce while awake. The weird part, as if it wasn't weird enough already. The songs seemed to follow the rhythm of mining. The melodies matched the tempo of pickaxe swings. The harmonies echoed the sounds of copper being separated from stone, and the overall compositions had a distinctly geological quality that somehow made perfect sense if you'd spent enough time underground. Imagine trying to explain this to your modern sleep specialist. Well, doctor, I seem to be composing symphonies in my sleep, but only ones that sound like mining equipment, and I can't remember any of it when I wake up. The mining communities didn't treat this as a medical oddity to be cured. They embraced it as a form of entertainment and in some cases divine communication. Families would actually adjust their sleeping arrangements to be closer to their household sleep singer, and neighbours would sometimes request specific songs by leaving symbolic objects near the singer's bed. Want to hear the copper vein discovery song? Leave a small piece of copper ore by the sleeper's head, hoping for the safe journey underground melody. A mining tool placed just so might do the trick. It was like having a prehistoric jukebox that operated on unconscious request fulfillment. But here's where things got mildly stressful for the sleep singers themselves. They started feeling performance pressure even while unconscious. Some singers reported anxiety dreams about not producing good enough nocturnal concerts, or nightmares about forgetting the melodies their communities had come to expect. Bronzebeard might wake up feeling exhausted, not from physical labour, but from the psychological pressure of being the neighbourhood's primary source of nighttime entertainment. Imagine the responsibility of knowing that your sleep quality directly affected everyone else's enjoyment of their evening. Did you hear Bronzebeard's performance last night? Usually his underground flooding song is much more dramatic. I hope he's not coming down with something. The phenomenon created its own social dynamics. Sleep singers became informal community leaders, their unconscious musical choices influencing group decisions about mining locations, safety protocols, and even interpersonal conflicts. If the sleep song featured harmonies about avoiding a particular tunnel, the mining crew might genuinely consider changing their plans. It was like having a focus group that operated entirely through dream state musical compositions. The practical challenges were considerable. Sleep singers couldn't control their nocturnal performances, which meant they might launch into a rousing mining anthem just when everyone else was trying to fall asleep. This led to the development of singer schedules, informal agreements about when different sleep singers would be allowed to perform. Bronzebeard gets the first part of the night, Copper Voice takes the middle shift, and Tin Throat handles the pre-dawn slot. That way everyone gets some quiet sleep time and some musical entertainment. But scheduling unconscious performers is about as reliable as predicting the weather using tea leaves. Singers would sometimes sleep through their designated performance windows, leaving their audiences disappointed. Other times they'd have particularly energetic nights and sing right through someone else's scheduled quiet time. The communities developed surprisingly sophisticated ways to manage these challenges. Some groups appointed sleep conductors, people whose job was to gently influence the singers' performances through subtle, environmental cues. They'd adjust the temperature, introduce specific scents, or create gentle background sounds that might encourage certain types of songs. It was like being a DJ for unconscious performers, trying to create the right atmosphere for the kind of musical dreaming that would benefit the entire community. The most talented sleep conductors could allegedly influence not just the style of the songs, but their content. Want songs about successful mining ventures? Create an environment that feels prosperous and secure. Need melodies that would calm pre-mining anxiety? Focus on comfort and safety cues. Of course, this system was about as reliable as you'd expect when dealing with unconscious minds, environmental manipulation, and Bronze Age technology. Sleep conductors would spend hours preparing the perfect conditions for inspiring mining-themed lullabies, only to have their featured singer produce 3 hours of what sounded like rocks falling down a mountain. I specifically arranged everything to encourage the peaceful underground journey composition, and instead we got 4 hours of avalanche in a copper mine. What am I doing wrong? The pressure on both singers and conductors led to the development of backup entertainment systems, storytellers, musicians, and other performers who could fill in when the sleep singing didn't meet community expectations. Because apparently even unconscious entertainment needed understudies. By now, you've probably realised that Bronze Age miners had turned sleep into something resembling a complex logistical operation. But just when you think you've got a handle on their nocturnal peculiarities, we encounter what might be their most ambitious sleep-related innovation, the Great Sleep Migration. Picture this. You're copper arm again, and you've just discovered that your usual sleeping spot, that carefully chosen corner of your hut where the straw is just the right density and the roof doesn't leak too much, is no longer providing quality rest. Maybe the sleep-singing neighbour has changed their repertoire to something that sounds like rocks having an argument. Maybe the local mouse population has decided your sleeping area is prime real estate. Or maybe you've simply outgrown your current sleep environment the way you might outgrow a favourite coffee shop that suddenly starts playing music that makes your teeth hurt. The logical solution would be to adjust your sleeping arrangements within your existing space. Add more straw, negotiate with the neighbour, declare war on the mice. But Bronze Age miners, as you've learned, weren't particularly interested in logical solutions when creative ones were available. Instead, they developed a system of seasonal sleep migration that would make modern minimalists weep with envy and digital nomads nod with understanding. The concept was beautifully simple. Instead of trying to perfect one sleeping location, why not rotate through multiple sleeping spots throughout the year, following optimal sleep conditions the way birds follow favourable weather patterns? This wasn't just about comfort, though comfort was certainly part of it. The miners had observed that different sleeping locations seemed to produce different types of dreams, different quality of rest, and different levels of preparation for the next day's underground work. Some places were better for deep restorative sleep. Others seemed to encourage the kind of light, alert rest that kept you ready for unexpected mine emergencies. The migration routes weren't random. Mining communities developed elaborate maps of optimal sleeping locations, complete with seasonal ratings, dream quality assessments, and detailed notes about environmental factors that affected rest quality. The sleeping alcove behind Stonejaw's hut is excellent for deep winter rest, but avoid it during the rainy season unless you enjoy the sound of water dripping directly onto your forehead every 37 seconds. The elevated platform near the mine entrance provides superior ventilation for summer sleeping, but the sunrise light makes it unsuitable for anyone who values sleeping past dawn. These sleep migration maps became highly valued community resources, passed down through families and traded between mining settlements like precious commodities. A detailed sleep location guide could be worth several days' wages, and experienced sleep migrants were consulted like travel advisors. I'm thinking of trying the rocky outcrop near the eastern mine shaft for my autumn sleep rotation. What's your assessment of the wind patterns and rodent activity in that area? The migration system created its own social dynamics. Popular sleeping spots would become overcrowded during peak seasons, leading to reservation systems and waiting lists. Prime locations might be booked months in advance, with miners planning their sleep schedules around availability rather than personal preference. Some entrepreneurs, yes, Bronze Age miners had entrepreneurs, started offering sleeping location rental services. They'd scout new spots, test them for optimal sleep conditions, and then lease them to other miners for premium rates during high-demand periods. For just 3 extra copper pieces per moon cycle, you can have guaranteed access to the sheltered grove with a natural sound dampening and built-in morning sun alarm. No mice, no leaks, no snoring neighbours. Premium sleep location with a satisfaction guarantee. But the migration system also created unexpected challenges. Miners would sometimes get so attached to particular seasonal sleeping spots that they'd refuse to migrate when conditions changed. They'd stubbornly remain in summer locations well into winter, suffering through cold and discomfort rather than give up their favourite sleep environment. This led to the development of migration counsellors, community members who specialised in helping miners make healthy transitions between seasonal sleeping locations. They'd provide emotional support for miners who are having trouble letting go of unsuitable sleeping spots, and practical advice for adapting to new sleep environments. I understand your attachment to the moss-covered boulder formation, Tintooth, but it's been flooding regularly for 3 weeks now. Perhaps it's time to consider the elevated platform option we discussed. The most dedicated sleep migrants would maintain detailed journals documenting their experiences in different locations, noting factors like dream quality, morning energy levels, and overall satisfaction ratings. These journals became valuable references for future migration planning and were sometimes shared with other miners seeking optimal sleep solutions. According to my records, the Hollow Tree sleeping spot provides excellent dream recall but poor neck support. The cave entrance location offers superior protection from weather, but tends to produce anxiety dreams about cave-ins. The meadow area is perfect for summer but becomes completely unsuitable once the seasonal flooding begins. Some miners took the migration concept so seriously that they'd spend more time travelling between sleeping locations than actually sleeping in them. They'd become so focused on finding the perfect sleep environment that they'd exhaust themselves with constant relocation logistics. The communities eventually had to establish migration limits to prevent miners from wearing themselves out with excessive sleep location optimization. Too much time spent searching for perfect rest could actually cause worse sleep quality than just settling for good enough. It was like the Bronze Age version of analysis paralysis, except instead of endless research about mattress types and thread counts, it involved geographical surveys and seasonal weather pattern analysis. And just when the system seemed to be working smoothly, some innovative miners started experimenting with micro-migrations, changing sleeping locations multiple times within a single night to optimize different phases of their sleep cycles. Because apparently even migration needed to be optimized for maximum efficiency, now we're approaching what might be the most extraordinary aspect of Bronze Age mining sleep culture: the systematic attempt to industrialize dreaming. Yes, you read that correctly. These ancient miners tried to transform their dream lives into a kind of underground think tank, and the results were equal parts brilliant and completely bonkers. You're settling into your current migration location. Let's say it's the early autumn rotation, so you're probably in that nice spot near the stream with the natural windbreak, and instead of simply hoping for good dreams, you're participating in what the mining community called dream crafting. This wasn't just about encouraging helpful dreams, it was about manufacturing specific types of dreams for specific purposes. The concept emerged from the observation that miners who dreamed about their work often came up with creative solutions to underground challenges. Someone might dream about a new way to shore up unstable tunnels, or visualize a more efficient method for extracting ore from difficult veins. These work-related dreams seem to access a kind of problem-solving capability that conscious minds couldn't always achieve. Naturally, mining communities decided to systematize this process. Dream crafting involves elaborate pre-sleep preparation rituals designed to encourage specific types of dreams. Want to dream about finding new copper deposits? Spend your evening handling copper samples, studying geological formations, and mentally rehearsing successful mining scenarios. Hoping for dreams that would solve structural engineering problems? Focus your pre-sleep attention on support beams, tunnel design, and architectural challenges. It was like programming your unconscious mind to work on specific projects while you slept. The communities developed specialized roles for dream crafting support. Dream preparers would help miners set up their pre-sleep environments with appropriate visual, tactile, and olfactory cues. Dream recorders would be standing by when miners woke up, ready to capture and document any potentially useful dream content before it faded from memory. Quick, copper arm. You're mumbling something about twisted metal bindings and spiral support structures. Can you remember any details about the dream? And you'd be lying there, still half asleep, trying to reconstruct a complex engineering vision, while someone frantically takes notes about your drowsy mumbling. The most ambitious dream crafting experiments involved group dreaming sessions. Multiple miners would prepare to sleep together, focusing on the same challenges and hoping to generate complementary dreams that could be combined into comprehensive solutions. It was like forming a dream-based research and development team. Tonight we're all going to focus on the flooding problem in the eastern tunnels. Bronzebeard, you concentrate on drainage solutions. Tin Hand, focus on waterproofing materials. Stonejaw, see if you can dream up some kind of early warning system for water detection. The success rate for these group dreaming projects was about what you'd expect when trying to coordinate unconscious minds working on complex technical problems. Occasionally the miners would awaken with innovative, complementary solutions that seamlessly blended together like a puzzle. More often, they'd produce a collection of unrelated dreams about fish, childhood memories, and that embarrassing incident with the pickaxe from 3 summers ago. But the occasional successes were impressive enough to keep the system going, and some mining communities became quite sophisticated in their dream crafting techniques. They developed what we might recognize as early versions of lucid dreaming training, teaching miners to recognize when they were dreaming and to maintain some level of conscious control over their dream narratives. The goal was to stay focused on work-related problem-solving even while asleep. Remember, when you realize you're dreaming, don't get distracted by flying or other dream nonsense. Focus on the tunnel ventilation challenge. Use your dream state to visualize solutions that might not occur to your waking mind. This created some mildly stressful situations where miners felt pressure to be productive even while unconscious. Imagine the anxiety of knowing that your sleep performance was being evaluated not just for rest quality, but for creative problem-solving output. Sorry everyone, my dreams last night were completely useless. I spent the whole time dreaming about a giant copper-coloured rabbit that kept giving me mining advice that made no sense. I don't think we can use dig tunnels like carrot burrows as a viable engineering strategy. The communities eventually had to establish dream failure forgiveness policies to prevent miners from developing sleep anxiety that would actually reduce their dream productivity. Some of the most dedicated dream crafters started keeping detailed dream journals, documenting not just the content of their dreams, but the pre-sleep preparation techniques that seemed to produce the most useful results. These journals became valuable community resources, like recipe books for generating specific types of dreams. For dreams about ore quality assessment, I recommend spending the evening examining different metal samples while thinking about colour variations and density testing. Avoid eating fermented foods before sleep, as they seem to introduce random elements that distract from metallurgical focus. The most successful dream crafters developed personal specializations, becoming known for their ability to generate specific types of problem-solving dreams. Some became specialists in structural engineering dreams, others focused on geological survey dreams, and a few became known for their uncanny ability to dream about workplace safety solutions. These specialists would sometimes be consulted by other mining communities facing similar challenges. They'd travel to different settlements, learn about local mining problems, and then attempt to dream up solutions that could be implemented by the visiting community. It was like having Bronze Age consulting services powered by REM sleep and unconscious creativity. But the system also produced some wonderfully unexpected results. Miners who were trying to dream about technical solutions would sometimes come up with innovations in completely unrelated areas. Someone focusing on tunnel support might dream up new food preservation techniques. A miner concentrating on ore extraction might wake up with ideas for improved textile manufacturing. The community started maintaining unexpected innovation logs to capture these accidental discoveries, leading to a kind of Bronze Age cross-pollination of ideas between different industries and crafts. And just when the dream crafting system seemed to be reaching peak sophistication, some innovative miners started experimenting with dream trading, attempting to share their dreams with other people through detailed storytelling and visualization exercises. This suggests that even unconscious creativity required optimization for maximum distribution and collaborative efficiency. As you're drifting towards sleep in your modern bed, with your climate control and blackout curtains and probably a dozen different apps designed to optimize your rest, it's worth considering what happened to all this Bronze Age sleep innovation. Did these elaborate systems simply disappear when mining techniques evolved, or did they leave traces that still influence how we think about rest and dreams? The answer, as you might expect, is wonderfully complicated. Some of the Bronze Age sleep practices evolved into traditions that persisted for thousands of years. The concept of sleep migration, for instance, influenced the development of seasonal living patterns in many cultures. The idea that different environments produce different qualities of rest became embedded in various folk wisdom traditions about optimal sleeping conditions. Dream crafting techniques found their way into religious and spiritual practices where directed dreaming became associated with divine communication and prophetic vision. The systematic approach to dream incubation that Bronze Age miners developed can be traced through various mystery traditions, shamanic practices, and even early medical applications where dreams were used for diagnostic purposes. The competitive aspects of Bronze Age sleep culture evolved into more formal sleep-related customs and ceremonies. Various cultures developed rituals around bedtime, sleep quality assessment, and dream sharing that echo the miners' systematic approach to rest optimization. But perhaps the most significant legacy was the fundamental idea that sleep could be actively managed and optimized rather than simply endured. Bronze Age miners were among the first people to treat sleep as a skill that could be developed, a resource that could be managed, and a tool that could be used for specific purposes. This conceptual framework laid the groundwork for later developments in sleep medicine, dream research, and what we now call sleep hygiene. The miners recognized that environmental factors, social dynamics, and psychological preparation could dramatically affect sleep quality, which was remarkably sophisticated for its time. Their understanding that different types of rest served different purposes, that deep sleep, light sleep, and various dreaming states each had distinct benefits, predated modern sleep science by thousands of years. They were essentially conducting primitive sleep studies, using themselves as test subjects and developing practical applications for their discoveries. The social aspects of their sleep innovations were equally influential. The idea that individual sleep quality could affect community well-being, that sleep patterns could be coordinated for group benefit, and that sleep-related skills could be shared and taught became embedded in many cultures' approaches to rest and community living. Even some of their more unusual practices left lasting influences. The concept of sleep singing evolved into various traditional lullaby practices and bedtime musical customs. The idea of sleep location optimization influenced architectural approaches to bedroom design and the development of sleeping spaces in different cultures. Their systematic approach to managing sleep-related anxiety, recognizing that worry about sleep quality could actually interfere with rest, became a cornerstone of later therapeutic approaches to sleep disorders. Bronze Age miners were essentially practicing primitive cognitive behavioral therapy for sleep problems, but perhaps most importantly, they established the precedent that sleep was worth paying attention to, worth investing effort in, and worth treating as a serious aspect of human health and productivity. This wasn't just about getting enough rest. It was about getting the right kind of rest, in the right environment, with the right preparation and support systems. Modern sleep research continues to confirm many intuitive findings. We now know that sleep environments do significantly affect rest quality, that social factors can influence sleep patterns, that pre-sleep routines can improve sleep onset and quality, and that different types of sleep serve different physiological and psychological functions. the contemporary interest in sleep optimization, sleep tracking, and sleep-related wellness products reflects the same basic impulse that drove Bronze Age miners to develop their elaborate sleep management systems. We're still trying to solve the same fundamental challenge: how to get the kind of rest that sustains our demanding, often stressful lives. Of course, we have advantages that Bronze Age miners couldn't have imagined. We understand sleep physiology, we have effective treatments for sleep disorders, and we can create sleep environments that are safer and more comfortable than anything available 4,000 years ago. But we may have lost some of their wisdom about the social and psychological aspects of sleep. Their recognition that rest is not just an individual activity, but a community resource, that sleep quality affects not just personal performance but group well-being, and that the journey towards sleep can be as important as the sleep itself, offers insights that remain relevant today. As you settle into your sleep routine tonight, you're participating in a tradition that stretches back to those ancient copper miners who refused to accept poor sleep as an inevitable part of difficult work. They understood something that we're still learning: that good sleep is not a luxury but a necessity, not a passive experience, but an active skill, and not just about rest, but about preparing for whatever challenges tomorrow might bring. Their legacy lives on in every person who takes time to create a comfortable sleep environment, who develops bedtime routines that work for their individual needs, and who recognizes that rest is an investment in productivity and well-being, rather than time lost from more important activities. So tonight, as you adjust your pillow and settle into your carefully chosen sleep position, you're honouring thousands of years of human innovation in the art of rest. You're the beneficiary of countless generations of people who refused to accept that sleep was simply something that happened to them, rather than something they could actively improve. Your memory foam mattress and your smartphone sleep tracking apps would probably amaze the Bronze Age miners, but they'd immediately understand your desire to optimize your rest for tomorrow's challenges. They'd recognize the familiar human impulse to turn even unconsciousness into an opportunity for improvement and innovation. And maybe, in their honor, you could take a moment to appreciate not just the sleep you're about to enjoy, but all the creativity, experimentation, and stubborn determination that made it possible. From their underground napping experiments to your white noise machine by the bed, it's all part of the same ongoing human project, the quest for rest that truly restores. Sweet dreams. The Bronze Age miners would be proud of how far we've come and how much we still have in common with those ancient seekers of perfect sleep. After all, some things never change. We all just want to wake up feeling like we can face whatever the day might throw at us, whether it's a dangerous mine shaft or a challenging Monday morning. And in that universal desire for restorative rest, we're connected across thousands of years to those ingenious, sleep-obsessed miners who turned bedtime into an art form and dreaming into a collaborative enterprise. Rest well, knowing you're part of a very long tradition of people who take their sleep seriously and aren't afraid to get creative about it.